There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to a world before machines. It is not an empty silence, but a silence filled with small living sounds. The creak of a wooden gate in the morning breeze, the soft murmur of a stream winding through a field of barley, the low hum of a spinning wheel turning slowly beside a window of hand-blown glass. If you were to stand in the English countryside in the year 1740, you would hear these sounds drifting through the air like old familiar songs, and you would feel, in the rhythm of the day around you, a pace of life that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The sun would rise, and with it, an entire village would stir, not to the shrill cry of a factory bell, but to the slow brightening of the sky and the distant crowing of a rooster somewhere down the lane. If you enjoy these kinds of calm, immersive journeys through history, consider subscribing to this channel. Every episode is a new doorway into the past, told at a pace that invites you to linger. Today we step into the world of the Industrial Revolution. Not the grand narrative of kings and inventors, but the everyday lives of the men, women and children who lived through the most dramatic transformation in human history. Their mornings, their meals, their labours, their homes, all of it changed, and changed forever, in the space of a few generations. This is their story. Picture yourself walking through a small village in the English Midlands sometime around 1750. The air's clean, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, of wood smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, and of bread baking somewhere behind a whitewashed cottage wall. The road beneath your feet is nothing more than packed dirt, softened by recent rain and marked with the tracks of a cart that passed through earlier in the morning. There is no pavement, no curbing, no street lamps, only the gentle contour of the land, shaped over time by the passage of feet and hooves. The cottages that line this lane are small and low, built from local stone or timber and daub, with thatched roofs that slope down in thick, rounded layers. Each home is surrounded by a small plot of land, a vegetable garden, a pen for a pig or a few chickens, perhaps a row of bean poles leaning against a fence. Inside, the rooms are dark and close, heated by a single fire that serves for both warmth and cooking. The floors are packed earth or rough flagstone, and the furniture is sparse but solid. A wooden table, a bench, a stool, a bed frame strung with rope to support a straw mattress. There is no running water, no indoor plumbing, no glass in the windows that is not slightly warped and greenish. And yet, to the people who live here, this is home. Familiar, rooted, and inseparable from the landscape around it. The rhythm of life in such a village was governed not by the clock but by the season. In spring, the fields had to be ploughed and sown, back-breaking work done behind a horse or an ox, guided by the farmer's steady hand on the wooden handles of a plough that had not changed much since the Middle Ages. In summer, there was hay to be cut and dried, gardens to be tended, hedges to be trimmed. Autumn brought the harvest, the great communal effort that determined whether a family would eat well through the winter or scrape by on turnips and oats. And in winter, when the fields lay dormant and the days were short and cold, there was mending to be done, tools to be repaired, fences to be rebuilt, and long evenings spent by the fire with little more than candlelight and conversation for entertainment. This was the world of pre-industrial Britain, a world that moved slowly, predictably, and with a kind of deep, unconscious trust in the turning of the seasons. It was a world in which most people never travelled more than a few miles from the place where they were born. It was a world in which a man's trade was often the same as his father's and his grandfather's, in which the church bell marked the hours and the harvest feast marked the year's great turning point. It was not a perfect world, far from it. Poverty was widespread, disease was common, and the average life expectancy hovered somewhere around 35 to 40 years. But it was a world with a certain coherence, a certain intactness that would soon be shattered by forces no one fully understood. To appreciate what the Industrial Revolution did to daily life, you must first feel what daily life was like before it arrived. And so we begin there, in the fields, in the cottages, in the slow, steady pulse of a world about to change. The economy of pre-industrial Britain was overwhelmingly agricultural. In 1750, roughly 80% of the population lived in rural areas, and the vast majority of families earned their living from the land, either as tenant farmers, smallholders, or agricultural labourers. The working day began at dawn and ended at dusk, shaped entirely by the availability of natural light. There were no gas lamps, no electric bulbs, no artificial illumination beyond the flickering glow of a tallow candle or a rushlight. A dried rush dipped in animal fat that gave off a dim, smoky flame barely sufficient for reading, if anyone in the household could read at all. Breakfast in a typical rural household was simple. It might consist of a bowl of porridge made from oats or barley, perhaps with a splash of milk if the family kept a cow, or a slice of coarse bread spread with a thin scraping of butter or dripping. Tea, which would later become the great staple drink of the British working class, was still something of a luxury in the mid-18th century, and many families made do with small beer, a weak, slightly fermented brew that was safer to drink than water, which was often drawn from wells or streams contaminated by animal waste. After breakfast, the working day began. For the men and older boys of the household, this usually meant going out into the fields. The nature of the work depended on the season, but it was almost always physical, repetitive, and exhausting. Ploughing, sowing, weeding, hoeing, harvesting, threshing. Each task required immense stamina and a familiarity with the land that bordered on instinct. A farmer might know every dip and rise of his fields, every patch of clay and gravel, every spot where the water tended to pool after a heavy rain. He knew his soil the way a sailor knows his sea, not through abstract study, but through years of direct bodily experience. For the women and girls of the household, the day was no less demanding. While the men worked the fields, the women managed the domestic economy, a full-time job in itself. There was bread to be baked, meals to be prepared over an open fire, clothes to be washed by hand in cold water and hung on a line to dry. There was butter to be churned, cheese to be made, ale to be brewed. There were children to be cared for, infants to be nursed, toddlers to be watched, older children to be put to work on small tasks like gathering eggs or feeding the chickens. And throughout it all, there was spinning. Spinning was the great domestic industry of pre-industrial England, and it was almost exclusively women's work. Using a simple spinning wheel, a device that had been in use for centuries, women turned raw wool or flax into thread, which could then be woven into cloth by the men on a hand loom. In many households, spinning was not just a domestic chore but a source of income. Under what was known as the putting out system, a merchant or clothier would supply raw wool to rural families who would spin it into thread at home and return it for a small payment. The merchant would then have the thread woven into cloth, which he would sell at market. This was a decentralised, cottage-based form of manufacturing that spread work across hundreds of individual homes, each one a tiny workshop in its own right. The putting out system had existed in various forms since the late Middle Ages, and by the early 18th century, it was the backbone of the English textile industry. In the counties of Lancashire and Yorkshire, in the Midlands and the West Country, thousands of families supplemented their agricultural income by spinning and weaving in their homes. The rhythm of this work was intertwined with the rhythm of the farm. In busy seasons, when the fields demanded all hands, the spinning wheel fell silent. In quieter months, when the land lay fallow, The wheel turned long into the evening, filling the cottage with its soft rhythmic hum. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant for the texture of daily life. Work in the pre-industrial world was not something you went to. It was something that happened where you lived. There was no commute, no factory gate, no distinction between the place where you laboured and the place where you ate and slept. The loom stood in the same room where the family gathered for meals. The spinning wheel sat beside the hearth where the children played. The farm was just outside the door, and the tools of the trade hung on the wall or leaned in the corner, always within reach. Life and work were woven together so tightly that they were almost indistinguishable, a single fabric of effort, rest, and routine that wrapped around the family like a second skin. This is not to romanticize it. The pre-industrial village had its share of misery. Hunger was never far away, especially in years when the harvest failed. Disease struck without warning and without cure. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and a dozen other afflictions that modern medicine would later learn to prevent or treat were constant threats. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Perhaps 1 in every 3 or 4 children died before reaching the age of 5. Dental care was non-existent. Surgical knowledge was primitive. A broken bone, a difficult childbirth, an infected wound. Any of these could mean death, or a lifetime of pain and disability. And yet, for all its hardships, this world had a quality that would be largely lost in the decades to come. A quality of wholeness, of rootedness, of belonging to a place and a community in a way that was both tangible and deeply felt. People knew their neighbours. They shared their celebrations and their sorrows. They gathered at the parish church on Sundays, exchanged gossip at the village well, and helped one another bring in the harvest when the weather was good and the grain was ripe. Their world was small, but it was their own, shaped by their hands, sustained by their labour, and passed down with all its customs and traditions from one generation to the next. The first cracks in this ancient order appeared in the middle decades of the 18th century, and they came, at first, not from the factories or the machines, but from the land itself. The process known to historians as the enclosure movement had been unfolding in fits and starts for centuries, but it accelerated dramatically in the decades between 1750 and 1820. What enclosure meant in simple terms was the consolidation of the old open field system, in which villagers held scattered strips of land in large common fields and shared access to common pastures, woods and wastelands, into compact individually owned parcels of land surrounded by fences or hedgerows. This was done through Acts of Parliament, usually at the behest of the larger landowners, who saw in enclosure an opportunity to improve agricultural efficiency and increase their profits. For the wealthier farmers, enclosure was a boon. With their land consolidated, they could experiment with new crops, new rotations, and new methods of cultivation that were impossible under the old strip system, where every decision had to be made communally. They could drain wet fields, plant turnips for winter fodder, breed better livestock, and invest in new tools and techniques. This was the era of the so-called agricultural revolution, a quieter, less dramatic transformation than the industrial revolution that followed it, but one that was, in many ways, its essential precondition. By increasing the productivity of the land, the agricultural revolution freed up a surplus of labour, men, women, and children, who were no longer needed in the fields and who would, in time, provide the workforce for the new factories. But for the smaller farmers, the cottagers, and the landless labourers, enclosure was often a catastrophe. The loss of common rights, the right to graze a cow on the village common, to gather firewood from the waste ground, to glean the last ears of grain from the harvested fields, could make the difference between survival and destitution. Many smallholders, unable to afford the legal cost of the enclosure process or the expense of fencing their newly allocated plots, were forced to sell out and join the ranks of the wage labourers, working for others on land they had once thought of as partly their own. Others gave up on the countryside altogether and drifted toward the towns, looking for work, for opportunity, for some way to feed their families in a world that was rapidly leaving them behind. This slow, painful exodus from the land was one of the great unsung dramas of the age. It happened family by family, village by village, over the course of decades, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long, grinding process of dispossession that reshaped the social landscape of England as profoundly as any battle or revolution. The people who left the villages for the towns carried with them not just their tools and their clothes, but their habits, their skills, their memories, and their sense of who they were. They were farmers who could read the weather and the soil, spinners who knew the feel of raw wool between their fingers, weavers who understood the tension of the warp and the rhythm of the shuttle. And they were about to enter a world that had no use for any of these things. There were other forces at work too in those years before the machines arrived. Britain's population was growing, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, driven by a modest decline in mortality rates and a gradual increase in fertility. In 1750, the population of England and Wales was roughly 6 million. By 1800, it had nearly doubled to around 9 million. By 1850, it would reach almost 18 million. This surge in population created new demands for food, for clothing, for housing, for goods of every kind, and it swelled the ranks of those available for work, creating a vast pool of cheap labour that the emerging industries would eagerly exploit. At the same time, Britain's position as a global trading power was generating immense wealth and opening up new markets. The colonies in the Caribbean, in North America and in India provided raw materials, cotton, sugar, tobacco, indigo, and served as captive markets for finished goods. The triangular trade connecting Britain, West Africa and the Americas had made fortunes for the merchants of Liverpool, Bristol and London, and some of that capital was now flowing into new ventures, mines, canals, and eventually factories. The infrastructure of commerce, banks, insurance companies, joint stock companies, and an increasingly sophisticated financial system was growing to support these new enterprises, creating an environment in which entrepreneurship and innovation could flourish. And then there were the inventors, the tinkerers, the mechanics, the self-taught engineers who, working in their workshops and sheds, were developing the machines that would change everything. Some of them were educated men with connections to the scientific societies of the day. Others were practical craftsmen, millwrights and clockmakers and blacksmiths who solved problems by trial and error, by the steady accumulation of small improvements, by the stubborn refusal to accept that something could not be done. In 1764, a weaver named James Hargreaves, working in the village of Oswald Twistle in Lancashire, invented the spinning jenny, a simple, hand-powered machine that allowed a single spinner to work 8 spindles at once instead of 1. It was a modest device, wooden-framed and inexpensive, but it multiplied productivity enormously. Within a few years, improved versions could handle 16, then 30, then 80 spindles. The spinning jenny did not require water power or a factory. It could be used in the home, and for a time it simply intensified the existing cottage industry. But it was a harbinger of things to come. 5 years later, in 1769, Richard Arkwright patented the water frame, a spinning machine powered not by human hands, but by the force of flowing water. Unlike the jenny, the water frame required a fixed location beside a river or stream and a purpose-built structure to house it. It was, in other words, a factory machine, one that demanded a new kind of workplace, a new kind of worker, and a new kind of discipline. Arkwright built his first mill at Cromford in Derbyshire in 1771, and within a decade he had become one of the wealthiest men in England, his factories humming with the sound of hundreds of spindles turning day and night. And then, in 1779, Samuel Crompton combined the best features of the spinning jenny and the water frame into a single machine he called the spinning mule. The mule could produce thread that was both fine and strong, suitable for the delicate muslin fabrics that had previously been imported from India at great expense. It was a breakthrough of extraordinary significance, and it set the stage for the explosive growth of the cotton industry that would follow in the coming decades. These inventions did not emerge from nowhere. They were responses to a specific economic problem, the chronic shortage of thread in the English textile industry. For every weaver working at a hand loom, it took 4 or 5 spinners to keep the looms supplied with yarn. The invention of the flying shuttle by John Kay in 1733 had made weaving faster, doubling a weaver's output, and making the bottleneck at the spinning stage even more acute. The spinning jenny, the water frame, and the mule were all attempts to solve this imbalance, to produce more thread, faster, with fewer hands. And solve it they did, with consequences that rippled far beyond the textile trade. For the moment, though, let us stay here, on the threshold of change, in the last years of the old order. The sun is setting over the English countryside, casting long shadows across the fields of wheat and barley that stretch to the horizon. In the villages, the day's work is winding down. The farmers are coming in from the fields, their faces brown and weathered, their boots caked with mud. The women are drawing water from the well, gathering the children in from the garden, stirring the pot that has been simmering over the fire all afternoon. Somewhere, in a cottage window, a candle is being lit. A small, soft flame that pushes back the gathering darkness and fills the room with a warm, unsteady glow. This is the world that's about to disappear, not all at once, and not everywhere. The old rhythms would linger in remote corners of the countryside for decades to come. But in the towns, in the river valleys, in the coal fields and the cotton districts, something new is stirring. The machines are coming, and with them, a way of life that no one alive in 1760 could have imagined. The transformation began quietly enough. The first factories were small, inconspicuous affairs, converted barns, old warehouses, modest brick buildings standing beside rivers and streams that provided the water power to drive their machinery. They did not look at first glance like the engines of revolution, but the principles they embodied, the concentration of workers under one roof, the division of labour into simple repetitive tasks, the subordination of human rhythm to the rhythm of the machine. These principles would remake the world. Richard Arkwright's mill at Cromford, in the valley of the River Derwent, is sometimes called the first true factory in the modern sense. It was not a large building by later standards, perhaps 5 stories tall, built from the local grit stone with rows of windows that let in the light needed for the workers to tend the machines. But it was something new in the world, a place where dozens and eventually hundreds of workers came together not to practice their individual crafts, but to serve a single, integrated system of production governed by the relentless turning of the water wheel. The workers at Cromford were not the skilled artisans of the old system. Many of them were women and children, cheaper to employ, easier to discipline, and, with their small, nimble fingers, well suited to the fine work of piecing together broken threads and cleaning the moving parts of the machinery. Arkwright recruited entire families from the surrounding countryside, housing them in purpose-built cottages near the mill and organising their lives around the demands of production. The working day was long. 13 or 14 hours was not unusual. and it was punctuated not by the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset, but by the factory bell, which rang at fixed intervals to mark the beginning and end of shifts. This was perhaps the most profound change that the factory system brought to daily life, the imposition of clock time. For thousands of years, human beings had lived by the sun and the seasons, rising when it was light and resting when it was dark, working hard when the weather allowed, and taking it easy when the weather did not. The factory demanded something different. It demanded regularity, the same hours, every day, regardless of the weather, regardless of the season, regardless of how the worker felt. The machine did not care whether it was raining outside, or whether the spinner's child was sick, or whether the harvest moon was rising over the fields. The machine ran on its own time, and the workers had to conform to it. This discipline did not come naturally to people who had grown up in the countryside, accustomed to setting their own pace and managing their own time. The early factory owners complained constantly about the difficulty of getting their workers to show up on time, to stay at their post for the full shift, to resist the temptation to take unofficial breaks or wander off to attend a fair or a market. Fines were imposed for lateness, for singing, for looking out the window. In some factories, the doors were locked once the shift began, and workers who arrived late were forced to wait outside until the next break, losing hours of pay. In others, the factory clock was deliberately set fast to squeeze a few extra minutes of work out of every shift. The transition from agricultural time to industrial time was one of the great cultural upheavals of the modern era, and its effects were felt not just in the workplace, but in every corner of daily life. Meals had to be eaten at set times instead of when the work allowed. Sleep had to be rationed to fit the demands of the shift schedule. Children had to be roused from their beds in the pre-dawn darkness and marched to the factory before the first light of day. The ancient rhythm of the day, a rhythm shaped by the angle of the sun and the needs of the body, was replaced by the mechanical rhythm of the clock, a rhythm that was relentless, unvarying, and indifferent to human fatigue. Inside the factory, the working conditions were often appalling. The air was thick with cotton dust, fine white fibres that floated in the warm, humid atmosphere like a perpetual snowfall and settled on everything, on the machines, on the floors, on the workers' hair and clothing and skin. Breathing in this dust day after day, year after year, led to a range of respiratory diseases, chronic coughs, bronchitis, and a condition known to contemporaries as spinner's phthisis, a slow wasting of the lungs that was essentially a form of occupational tuberculosis. Many spinners developed what was called mill fever when they first started work, a bout of coughing, headaches, and nausea that was their body's response to the toxic atmosphere of the factory floor. The noise was another assault on the senses. A cotton mill in full operation was a clattering, crashing, hammering cacophony of sound. The whir of the spindles, the clack of the shuttles, the groan of the drive shafts, the rhythmic thud of the power loom, all overlapping and reverberating in the enclosed space of the mill room until it became a wall of noise that made normal conversation impossible. Workers learned to communicate by lip reading and hand signals, and many of them suffered permanent hearing damage from years of exposure to the relentless din. The heat was oppressive, particularly in the spinning rooms, which were kept deliberately warm and humid to prevent the cotton threads from snapping. Temperatures could reach 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, and the air was so saturated with moisture that the workers' clothing was often damp with sweat. There were no fans, no ventilation systems, no cooling mechanisms of any kind, only the stifling, steamy heat of a room packed with bodies and machines, all working at full capacity from dawn to dusk. And then there were the machines themselves, powerful, fast-moving, and completely unforgiving of human error. The gears, belts, and drive shafts that connected the water wheel or steam engine to the individual machines were fully exposed. with no guards or safety covers to protect the workers who moved among them. Loose clothing could be caught in the gears and draw a worker into the machinery in an instant. Hair could be tangled in the spinning mechanisms, fingers could be crushed between the rollers, and accidents happened with terrible frequency. Mangled hands, severed fingers, broken arms, and in the worst cases deaths that were as sudden as they were gruesome. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many of the tasks in the early factories were performed by children as young as 5 or 6 years old, small enough to crawl beneath the machines to sweep up loose cotton, nimble enough to piece together broken threads, and cheap enough to employ at a fraction of an adult's wages. These children, known as scavengers and piecers, worked the same long hours as the adults, in the same brutal conditions, and suffered the same injuries, or worse. Their growing bodies, still soft and developing, were more easily damaged by the heat, the dust, and the physical strain of the work. Their bones were more easily broken, their lungs were more easily scarred, and their spirits, perhaps, were more easily crushed. Many of these child workers were orphans or pauper children, sent to the factories by parish authorities under the system of apprenticeship, a genteel word for what was, in many cases, little more than indentured servitude. Under the terms of their apprenticeship, these children were legally bound to the factory owner for a period of years, usually until they reached the age of 21, during which time they received no wages, only their board and lodging. They slept in dormitories attached to the factory, sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed, sharing lice-infested blankets and eating whatever meagre food the owner chose to provide. Their lives were entirely in the hands of the factory master, and the quality of their treatment depended entirely on his character. Some factory owners, Arkwright among them, were relatively humane employers who provided decent housing, schooling and working conditions for their apprentices. But many others were not. Robert Blincoe, who spent his childhood as a factory apprentice in the 1790s, later described his experience in harrowing terms: the constant beatings, the near-starvation rations, the injuries sustained while working with unguarded machinery, and the casual cruelty of the overseers who drove the children to work faster, harder, longer. His memoir, published in 1832, became one of the most powerful indictments of the factory system and helped fuel the growing movement for reform. But we are getting ahead of our story. Let us stay for a while longer in the early days of the factory age, the 1770s, the 1780s, the 1790s, when the new system was still finding its form and the old world was still within living memory. In these decades, the factories were spreading, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The river valleys of Derbyshire, Lancashire and Yorkshire, with their fast-flowing streams and abundant rainfall, were the heartlands of the new cotton industry, and it was here that the first great mills were built. Arkwright's Cromford Mill was followed by others, at Belper, at Milford, at Cressbrook, at Stile, each one larger and more ambitious than the last. The landscape was changing. Where once there had been only green fields and quiet villages, there were now tall brick buildings with their rows of glinting windows, their chimneys sending up thin columns of smoke, and their water wheels turning steadily in the current of the river below. The towns were changing too. Manchester, which in 1750 had been a modest market town of perhaps 17,000 inhabitants, was beginning its extraordinary transformation into the world's first industrial city. The arrival of the cotton trade brought thousands of new workers flooding into the town, drawn by the promise of employment in the new mills and workshops. Houses were thrown up at frantic speed, cheap, cramped, back-to-back terraces built on narrow streets with no drainage, no sanitation, and no regard for the health or comfort of their inhabitants. The population swelled from 17,000 in 1750 to over 70,000 by 1800, and it would continue to grow at a staggering rate in the decades that followed. The transformation of Manchester was repeated, on a smaller scale, in dozens of other towns across the industrial heartland of England. Birmingham, which had long been a centre of metalworking and small manufactures, grew rapidly as the demand for nails, screws, buttons, buckles, and other metal goods expanded. Sheffield, famous for its cutlery, saw its population surge as the steel and iron trades boomed. Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, and Halifax grew fat on the woolen and worsted trades. Nottingham became a centre of lace and hosiery production. Stoke-on-Trent, in the potteries, produced the china and earthenware that graced tables from London to Calcutta. Each town had its speciality, its particular trade, its distinctive character, but all of them shared the same fundamental experience: the rapid, often chaotic growth that came with the arrival of industry. What did it feel like to live in one of these rapidly growing towns? The answer depends, of course, on who you were and where in the town you lived. For the factory owners, the merchants, and the prosperous middle class, the new industrial towns offered opportunities for wealth and advancement that had no precedent in English history. A man with capital, enterprise, and a willingness to take risks could build a fortune in a single generation, could rise from the ranks of the yeomanry or the shopkeepers to become a man of means, with a fine house on the edge of town, a carriage, servants, and a seat on the borough council. The success stories of the early industrialists, men like Arkwright, Josiah Wedgwood, Matthew Boulton, Robert Peel the Elder, became the stuff of legend, proof that in this new world talent and hard work could triumph over the accidents of birth. But for the vast majority of the townspeople, the workers, the labourers, the poor, the experience of industrial urbanisation was very different. The houses in which they lived were mean, cramped, and often appallingly unsanitary. In the older parts of the town, families crowded into cellars and attics, sharing a single room with their children, their belongings, and sometimes their pig. In the newer districts, the back-to-back terraces provided a little more space, but not much. A typical working-class home might consist of 2 rooms, a downstairs room that served as kitchen, living room, and workshop, and an upstairs room that served as bedroom for the entire family. There was no running water, no toilet, no drain. Waste was disposed of in a communal cesspit, or more often simply thrown out into the street, where it mingled with the horse dung, the kitchen slops, and the runoff from the nearest factory. The streets themselves were narrow, unpaved, and perpetually muddy. In the poorer neighbourhoods, they were little more than alleyways, hemmed in by tall buildings on either side, and darkened by the smoke that hung over the town like a permanent fog. The air was thick with the stench of sewage, of coal smoke, of animal and human waste, of the chemical effluent that the factories dumped into the rivers and canals. The River Irwell, which flowed through the centre of Manchester, was described by one observer in the 1830s as the hardest worked river in the world. A black fetid stream that carried the waste of 100 factories and 100,000 homes, its waters so polluted that no fish could live in them and no person could stand on its banks without gagging. Disease thrived in these conditions. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis and dysentery were endemic in the industrial towns, striking the poor with devastating frequency. The cholera epidemics of 1831 and 1848 were particularly catastrophic, sweeping through the crowded tenements and claiming thousands of lives. But the everyday killers, the diseases of poverty and filth, were even more destructive, grinding down the health of the working population year after year, generation after generation. The life expectancy of a labourer in Manchester in the 1840s was just 17 years, not because people typically died at 17, but because so many infants and children died before they reached adulthood that the average was dragged down to this appalling figure. The diet of the urban poor was monotonous and often nutritionally inadequate. The staples were bread, potatoes and tea, cheap, filling, but lacking in the vitamins and minerals needed for good health. Meat was a luxury that most working families could afford only occasionally, if at all. Milk was scarce and often adulterated, watered down by unscrupulous vendors, or contaminated by the diseases of the cows that produced it. Vegetables were expensive and hard to come by in the heart of the city, where there was no garden plot to cultivate and no market nearby. Sugar, treacle, and cheap jams provided calories but little nutritional value, and alcohol, gin, beer, and whiskey was consumed in staggering quantities, not only as a social lubricant and a source of comfort, but as a means of dulling the pain and monotony of a life that offered few other pleasures. For the women of the industrial working class, life was a relentless round of labour, both inside and outside the home. Many women worked in the factories alongside men, particularly in the textile mills, where their labour was in high demand. They earned less than men, typically about half the wage, and they were often assigned the most monotonous and least skilled tasks. But their earnings were essential to the family budget, and the loss of a woman's wages could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation. At the same time, the women of the household were expected to maintain the home, to cook, to clean, to wash, to mend, to care for children and the sick and the elderly. In the absence of running water, of indoor plumbing, of gas or electric light, every domestic task was a labour in itself. Washing clothes meant hauling water from a standpipe or pump, heating it over a fire, scrubbing each garment by hand on a washboard, wringing it out and hanging it to dry, a process that could take an entire day. Cooking meant tending a fire, preparing food from scratch, and cleaning up afterward with nothing more than cold water and a cloth. And caring for children meant doing all of this while keeping one eye on a toddler and one ear open for the cry of an infant. The children of the working class entered the world of labour at an astonishingly young age. In the factories, as we have already seen, children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work. But child labour was not confined to the factories. In the mines, children worked as trappers, sitting alone in the darkness for hours on end, opening and closing ventilation doors to maintain the flow of air through the underground tunnels. In the potteries, children carried heavy loads of clay and fired goods, breathing in lead dust that would eventually poison them. In the chimneys, small boys, some as young as 4, were sent up the narrow, soot-encrusted flues to scrub them clean, their skins scraped raw by the rough brickwork, their lungs choked with soot, their bodies twisted by the unnatural contortions required to navigate the tight passages. The use of climbing boys in the chimney-sweeping trade was one of the most notorious forms of child labour in industrial Britain, and it persisted for decades despite repeated attempts to ban it. The master sweep would typically acquire a child, often from a workhouse or from parents too poor to feed him, and train him to climb the flues by lighting a small fire beneath him to encourage speed. The work was dangerous, dirty, and deeply injurious to health. Many climbing boys developed a form of scrotal cancer caused by prolonged exposure to soot, a disease first identified by the surgeon Percival Pott in 1775, making it one of the earliest recognised occupational cancers in medical history. These were the human costs of the Industrial Revolution, the prices paid in flesh and blood and suffering by the men, women and children who powered the machines and built the wealth that transformed Britain from an agricultural kingdom into the workshop of the world. They are not easy to contemplate, and they should not be contemplated lightly, but they are an essential part of the story, a part that cannot be separated from the tales of invention and enterprise and progress that are more commonly associated with this era. For every Arkwright who built a fortune, there were thousands of spinners who lost their health. For every Watt who improved the steam engine, there were thousands of miners who went down into the darkness and never came back. For every Brunel who built a bridge or a tunnel or a railway, there were thousands of navvies who broke their backs in the mud and the rain, earning barely enough to feed their families and dying years before their time. The Industrial Revolution was a story of human ingenuity and human suffering, of great leaps forward and terrible costs, and the daily lives of the people who lived through it reflected both sides of this vast, contradictory transformation. Let us now turn our attention more closely to the experience of work itself, the thing that shaped every day, every week, every year of a working person's life in industrial Britain. For it was in the nature of work and in the relationship between the worker and the work that the most profound changes of the Industrial Revolution were felt. In the pre-industrial world, as we have seen, work was embedded in the fabric of domestic life. The farmer worked his own land, or land he rented from a landlord, following the rhythms of the seasons and the customs of his community. The artisan, the weaver, the blacksmith, the potter, the carpenter, practiced his craft in his own workshop, often with the help of one or two apprentices, producing goods to order for local customers. The pace of work was variable, shaped by the demands of the task and the preferences of the worker. It was common in many trades for artisans to observe St. Monday, an unofficial holiday taken to recover from the weekend's drinking, and to work longer hours later in the week to make up for lost time. The distribution of effort across the week was uneven, improvised, and intensely personal. The factory destroyed this world. In its place, it created a new world of work, one that was regular, regimented, and relentless. The factory worker did not choose when to start or stop. He did not set his own pace. He did not decide what to produce or how to produce it. He was, in the language of the time, a hand, an appendage of the machine, valued for his physical strength and manual dexterity, but stripped of the independence, the judgment, and the creative satisfaction that had once been the hallmarks of skilled labour. The division of labour, the breaking down of complex tasks into simple, repetitive steps, each performed by a different worker, was one of the defining features of the factory system. Adam Smith, writing in 1776, had celebrated the division of labour as the key to increase productivity, using the famous example of the pin factory to show how specialisation could multiply output. And so it could, but at a cost that Smith himself dimly acknowledged. A worker who spent his entire day performing a single mindless operation, pulling a lever, feeding a machine, tying a thread, lost the sense of purpose and mastery that came from seeing a task through from beginning to end. He became, in a very real sense, part of the machine, replaceable, interchangeable, and expendable. This dehumanization of work was one of the great themes of social criticism in the 19th century. Writers from William Blake to Charles Dickens, from Friedrich Engels to John Ruskin, returned again and again to the image of the factory as a place of mechanical tyranny, where human beings were reduced to the status of cogs in a vast, indifferent system. Blake's famous phrase about dark satanic mills, whatever its original meaning, became a shorthand for the horrors of industrialization, a potent symbol of everything that the old pre-industrial world had lost. But let us not deal only in grand themes and literary images. Let us come down to earth, to the level of daily experience, and ask, what did a typical day look like for a factory worker in, say, Manchester in the 1820s? The answer begins in darkness. The working day in most factories started at 6 in the morning, which meant that workers had to be up and moving by 5 at the latest. Earlier, if they had a long walk to the mill. In winter, this meant rising in complete darkness, fumbling for clothes in a cold room, and setting out through streets that were unlit and often treacherous with ice or mud. Breakfast, if there was time for it, was a hurried affair. A piece of bread, a cup of tea, perhaps a bowl of leftover porridge from the night before. At the factory gate, the workers filed in under the watchful eye of the overlooker, the foreman responsible for ensuring that every worker was at his or her post when the machinery started up. Lateness was punished with fines or, in some factories, with physical blows. Once inside, the workers took their places among the machines and began the day's labour, spinning, weaving, carding, combing, or whatever their particular station required. The work was monotonous, the noise was deafening, and the air was thick with dust and heat. The only break in the morning was a brief pause for a drink of water or tea, taken at the workers' station without stopping the machine. Lunch, or dinner, as the midday meal was called, came at noon, and it was usually the only proper break of the day. Workers had half an hour, or sometimes an hour, to eat whatever food they had brought with them, or to hurry home, if they lived nearby, for a hasty meal before the bell summoned them back. The afternoon shift continued until 7 or 8 in the evening, with perhaps one more short break for tea. By the time the workers filed out through the factory gates, they had been on their feet for 12, 13 or 14 hours, and the night was already falling. The walk home was a weary trudge through streets that were by now filling with the sounds of the evening, the clatter of clogs on cobblestones, the voices of women calling children in from the street, the rattle of a cart, the distant thud of a hammer in some workshop still hard at work. At home, there was a meal to be eaten, something simple cooked by whoever had been left in charge of the household during the day, and then, perhaps, a few minutes by the fire before exhaustion claimed the body and the mind surrendered to sleep. There was no leisure time, no recreation, no entertainment beyond what could be snatched in the margins of the day. The factory bell was the first sound of the morning and the last thought of the night, and in between there was only work. This was the reality of factory life for millions of men, women and children in the industrial towns of Britain. It was a reality shaped not by cruelty or malice, but by the cold logic of the market. The need to keep the machines running, the need to produce goods as cheaply as possible, the need to compete with rival manufacturers who were cutting their costs in exactly the same way. The factory owners were not, for the most part, sadists or tyrants. They were businessmen operating in a system that rewarded efficiency and punished compassion. Many of them genuinely believed that they were doing their work as a favour, providing employment where none had existed before, offering wages that, however meagre, were better than the destitution of the countryside. And in some narrow economic sense they were right. But the human cost of their enterprise was enormous, and it would take decades of agitation, reform and political struggle before the worst abuses of the factory system were brought under control. The home life of the industrial working class was shaped above all by the conditions of the dwellings in which they lived, and these conditions in the booming factory towns of early 19th century Britain were often almost indescribably bad. The problem was simple: too many people, too little housing. The towns were growing faster than anyone had ever anticipated, and the builders who threw up new housing to meet the demand were motivated by profit, not by any concern for the welfare of their tenants. The result was some of the most densely packed, poorly built, and wretchedly unsanitary housing in the history of the world. In Manchester, in Leeds, in Birmingham, in Glasgow, the working-class districts were warrens of narrow streets, dark courts, and blind alleys, packed with back-to-back houses that shared party walls on 3 sides and faced onto the street on the 4th. These houses were tiny, often no more than 15 feet square, with 2 rooms stacked one above the other. The ground floor room served as kitchen, living room, and sometimes workshop. The upper room was the bedroom, shared by the entire family, parents, children, and in many cases lodgers taken in to help pay the rent. The walls were thin, the ceilings were low, and the ventilation was almost non-existent. In winter, the rooms were cold and damp. In summer, they were stifling. Behind the houses, and sometimes beneath them, were the privies and the cesspits, the only sanitary facilities available to the residents of these districts. A single privy might serve an entire court of houses, 20, 30, sometimes 50 people, sharing a single wooden seat over a pit that was emptied only when it overflowed. The stench was overpowering, and the contamination of the surrounding soil and groundwater was severe. In some courts, the cesspits were located so close to the houses that their contents seeped through the walls and floors, filling the ground floor rooms with a miasma of filth that made even breathing an ordeal. Water, when it was available at all, came from communal standpipes or pumps that were often contaminated by the same cesspits they were meant to serve. In some neighbourhoods, water was available only for a few hours each day, and the residents had to queue for their share, carrying it back to their homes in buckets and storing it in whatever containers they could find. The idea that water should be tested for purity, or that its source should be protected from contamination, was still decades away. People drank whatever water was available, and they fell ill, from cholera, from typhoid, from dysentery, without understanding why. The interiors of these working-class homes were sparse and functional. Furniture was limited to the barest essentials: a table, a few chairs or stools, a bed or two, perhaps a chest for clothing. The floors were bare boards or flagstone, often damp and sometimes rotting. The walls were whitewashed, when they were treated at all, to mask the damp stains and the patches of mould that crept across them. Curtains, carpets, and ornamental objects were luxuries that only the better-off artisans could afford. For most families, the home was a shelter and nothing more, a place to eat, to sleep, and to escape the weather. Cooking was done over an open fire or, in later decades, on a small cast-iron range, a modest improvement that made it possible to bake bread, boil water, and cook meals with a little more control and efficiency. But fuel was expensive, and many families could afford to keep the fire burning only during the coldest months. In warm weather, food was eaten cold or purchased from street vendors: pies, muffins, baked potatoes, fried fish, that catered to the needs of a population without adequate kitchen facilities. The diet of the industrial working class was a subject of much concern to the reformers and investigators of the period, and with good reason. Malnutrition was widespread, particularly among women and children, and it contributed to the high rates of disease and mortality that plague the industrial towns. A family living on the wages of a single factory worker, perhaps 10 to 15 shillings a week, had little money left for food after paying the rent, buying fuel, and purchasing the barest necessities of clothing. The result was a diet dominated by the cheapest available foods: bread, potatoes, oatmeal, treacle, and tea. Meat appeared on the table perhaps once or twice a week, usually in the form of cheap cuts, tripe, offal, and scraps from the butcher's block. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare, expensive, and often suspect in quality. The adulteration of food was a widespread and deeply troubling problem. Bread, the staple food of the poor, was commonly adulterated with alum, a chemical compound that whitened the flour and gave the bread a better appearance, but had no nutritional value and could be harmful to health. Milk was routinely watered down, and sometimes contaminated with chalk or other whitening agents. Tea was adulterated with dried leaves of other plants, coloured with chemical dyes to mimic the appearance of genuine tea. Beer was doctored with all manner of additives to increase its potency or improve its flavour. The consumer had no way of knowing what was in the food he bought, and no legal protection against the dishonesty of the vendors who sold it. The health consequences of these conditions were severe. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, was the great killer of the industrial age, responsible for more death than any other single disease. It thrived in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated homes and workplaces of the poor, spreading from person to person through the air they breathed. A family that lost one member to tuberculosis was likely to lose others, as the disease passed silently from parent to child, from husband to wife, from sibling to sibling. By the middle of the 19th century, tuberculosis was killing an estimated 50,000 people a year in England and Wales, a staggering toll that fell disproportionately on the young, the poor, and the malnourished. Cholera, though less constant than tuberculosis, was far more terrifying. The disease struck with sudden, devastating force. A person who was healthy in the morning could be dead by nightfall, their body convulsing with cramps, their skin turning blue, their flesh wasting away as fluids poured from the body in unstoppable torrents. The cholera epidemics of 1831, 1848, 1854, and 1866 swept through the industrial towns like a scythe, killing thousands and terrifying millions. The disease was eventually traced to contaminated water, the great discovery of Dr. John Snow, who identified a polluted pump in Broad Street, London, as the source of the 1854 outbreak. But for decades, the cause of cholera remained a mystery, attributed variously to miasma, to divine punishment, to moral failings, and to the general filthiness of the poor. Typhus, known as jail fever or ship fever, was another scourge of the industrial towns. Like cholera, it was a disease of poverty and overcrowding, spread by the body lice that infested the clothing and bedding of the poor. A person could be covered in lice without knowing it, and the itching and scratching that accompanied an infestation provided an easy pathway for the bacteria to enter the bloodstream. Typhus was a miserable disease: high fever, violent headaches, a distinctive rash that spread across the body, and in many cases delirium that could last for days. The mortality rate was high, particularly among the old, the young, and the already weakened. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diphtheria took a heavy toll on the children of the industrial towns, killing thousands every year and leaving thousands more weakened and vulnerable to other diseases. Rickets, a disease of bone development caused by a lack of vitamin D and sunlight, was endemic among the children of the urban poor, who spent their days in the darkness of the factories and their nights in the darkness of the cellars, rarely seeing the sun. The bowed legs and deformed chests of rachitic children were a common sight on the streets of the industrial towns, a visible emblem of the physical price that the new way of life was exacting from the youngest and most vulnerable members of society. The mental strain of industrial life was, in its own way, as devastating as the physical. The sheer monotony of factory work, the same motions repeated thousands of times a day, day after day, week after week, year after year, was a form of psychological torture that crushed the spirit as surely as the machines crush the body. The loss of independence and autonomy, the sense of being controlled, directed, and watched at every moment, was a constant source of resentment and humiliation. The enforced separation from the natural world, from the fields, the sky, the changing seasons, the simple pleasures of outdoor life, created a kind of existential homesickness that was never fully articulated but was deeply felt. Alcohol became the great solace of the industrial poor, the one reliable source of warmth, of pleasure, of temporary escape from the grinding realities of factory life. The public house, or pub, was the social centre of the working class community, a place to meet friends, to share gossip, to argue about politics, to forget for a few hours the noise and the dust and the weariness of the workday. But drinking brought its own problems: violence, debt, family breakdown, and the slow destruction of health that came with chronic alcohol abuse. The temperance movement, which gained strength in the 1820s and 30s, sought to address these problems by persuading working people to give up drinking entirely, but it met with limited success. For many, the pub was the only refuge they had, and they were not willing to surrender it. The emotional life of the industrial working class is one of the hardest things for the historian to recover. The records that survive, factory inspectors' reports, parliamentary inquiries, autobiographies, letters and diaries, give us glimpses, but they are fragmentary and often filtered through the assumptions and biases of the observers. What we can say, with some confidence, is that the disruption of the old social order, the breaking up of rural communities, the separation of families, the loss of traditional customs and celebrations, created a profound sense of dislocation that affected people at the deepest level of their being. The move from the countryside to the town was, for many, a move from a world they understood to a world that bewildered and frightened them. The routines of rural life, the familiar landscape, the predictable cycle of the seasons, the close-knit community of neighbours and kin, were replaced by the chaos, the noise, the anonymity, and the relentless pressure of urban industrial existence. Homesickness was common among the newly arrived workers, and many of them maintained their connections to the countryside for as long as they could, walking back to their villages on holidays and at harvest time, sending money home to aging parents, and naming their children after the places they had left behind. But the old world could not be sustained indefinitely. As the years passed and the towns grew, the ties to the countryside gradually weakened. The children who grew up in the factory towns had no memory of the fields and the village green. They knew only the streets, the mills, the smoke, and the noise. They adapted as human beings always do to the world they were given, and in doing so they created a new culture, a new set of values, a new way of being in the world that was recognisably different from anything that had come before. This new working-class culture was forged in the pubs and the chapels, the trade unions and the friendly societies, the music halls and the football grounds of the industrial towns. It was a culture of solidarity and mutual aid, born out of the shared experience of hardship and the recognition that, in a world where the individual worker was powerless, collective action was the only means of self-defense. It was a culture that valued loyalty, toughness, and a sardonic sense of humour, qualities that helped people endure the difficulties of their lives without being destroyed by them. And it was a culture that, for all its roughness and informality, produced its own forms of beauty, its own traditions, its own rituals and celebrations. But that is a story for later. For now, let us turn to the question of resistance, to the ways in which the people of industrial Britain pushed back against the forces that were reshaping their world. The resistance to industrialisation took many forms, from the spontaneous and violent to the organised and political. The most dramatic early expression of this resistance was the Luddite movement, which erupted in the textile districts of the Midlands and the north of England in 1811 and 1812. The Luddites were skilled workers, framework knitters, croppers, shearmen, and handloom weavers, whose livelihoods were being destroyed by the introduction of new machinery that could do their work faster, cheaper, and with less skill. They responded by smashing the machines, operating in small secretive bands, often under cover of darkness. The Luddites broke into factories and workshops and destroyed the offending machinery, stocking frames, shearing frames, power looms, with hammers, axes, and whatever else came to hand. They signed their threatening letters Ned Ludd, or General Ludd, after a possibly mythical youth who was said to have smashed 2 stocking frames in a fit of rage. The Luddite disturbances were concentrated in 3 main areas: the framework knitting districts of Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire, the woolen finishing districts of the West Riding of Yorkshire, and the cotton-weaving districts of Lancashire and Cheshire. In each case, the underlying cause was the same: the displacement of skilled workers by machines and the consequent loss of income, status and independence. But the specific grievances varied from place to place, and the Luddite movement was never a unified organisation with a single leadership or a coherent political programme. It was rather a series of local responses to local problems, connected by a common name, a common anger, and a common sense that the world was being remade in ways that left no room for the people who had built it. The government's response to the Luddites was swift and severe. Troops were sent into the affected districts. At one point, more soldiers were deployed against the Luddites than were serving under the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular War. Machine breaking was made a capital offence, and a series of trials at York in 1813 resulted in the execution of 14 men and the transportation of many more to the penal colonies of Australia. The Luddite movement was crushed by force, and its name entered the language as a synonym for irrational resistance to technological progress. But the label is unfair. The Luddites were not opposed to technology in principle. They were opposed to the way it was being used, to the fact that the benefits of the new machinery accrued entirely to the factory owners, while the costs were borne entirely by the workers. They were fighting not against progress, but against a particular distribution of its rewards and punishments. And in this they were raising questions that remain relevant to this day. The Luddites were not the only ones who resisted. Throughout the early decades of the 19th century, working people found ways to organise, to protest and to demand change. The trade union movement, though still illegal under the Combination Acts passed in 1799 and 1800, grew steadily in strength and confidence. Secret combinations of workers, weavers, tailors, printers, engineers, met in back rooms and public houses, pooling their resources to support members who were sick, injured or out of work, and occasionally striking to resist wage cuts or to demand better conditions. The repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 gave a legal, if fragile, foundation to the trade union movement, and the years that followed saw a flowering of working-class organisation. The National Association for the Protection of Labour, founded in 1830, attempted to unite workers across different trades into a single federation. The Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, launched by Robert Owen in 1834, briefly attracted 500,000 members before collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions and the determined opposition of the employers and the government. The most significant early triumph of working-class agitation was the passage of the Factory Act of 1833, the first effective piece of factory legislation in British history. The Act prohibited the employment of children under 9 in textile factories, limited the working hours of children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours a day, and required factory owners to provide 2 hours of schooling each day for child workers. Most importantly, it established a system of factory inspectors with the power to enter factories, examine conditions and enforce the law, a crucial innovation without which the Act would have been, like its predecessors, a dead letter. The 1833 Act was followed by a series of further reforms. The Mines Act of 1842, which prohibited the employment of women and children underground. The 10 Hours Act of 1847, which limited the working day for women and young persons in textile factories to 10 hours. And a long succession of factory acts, public health acts, and education acts that gradually, imperfectly, and often reluctantly extended the protections of the state to the most vulnerable members of industrial society. These reforms did not come easily. They were won through decades of agitation, campaigning and political struggle, through the testimony of witnesses before parliamentary committees, through the published reports of investigators and inspectors, through the speeches of reformers in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and through the steady, unglamorous work of thousands of men and women who refused to accept that the suffering of the industrial poor was an inevitable or acceptable price to pay for the nation's prosperity. Among the most effective advocates for reform were the factory inspectors themselves, men like Leonard Horner, Robert Baker and Robert Saunders, who visited hundreds of factories, interviewed thousands of workers and documented conditions with a thoroughness and humanity that made their reports among the most powerful documents of the age. Their accounts of child labour, of industrial accidents, of the health effects of factory work, and of the tricks and evasions practiced by unscrupulous employers provided the evidence on which the case for reform was built. There were also the journalists, the novelists, and the social investigators who brought the conditions of the industrial poor to the attention of a wider public. Elizabeth Gaskell, in her novels Mary Barton and North and South, depicted the lives of Manchester's working class with a compassion and a realism that shocked and moved her readers. Charles Dickens, in Hard Times, and Oliver Twist and many other works, used the power of fiction to expose the cruelties of the factory system, the workhouse, and the social order that sustained them. Friedrich Engels, a German industrialist's son who had come to Manchester to manage one of his father's factories, wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1845, a searing indictment of industrial capitalism that remains one of the essential texts of social history. And then there were the working people themselves, the men and women who told their own stories, in their own words, to anyone who would listen. The autobiographies and memoirs of former factory children, Robert Blincoe, William Dodd, James Miles and others, provided first-hand accounts of the suffering and exploitation that lay behind the wealth of the factory owners. Their testimony, given before parliamentary committees and published in pamphlets and newspapers, helped to build the moral case for reform and to create a public conscience that could no longer ignore the human cost of industrial progress. The story of reform is not a simple story of triumph. Progress was slow, uneven, and often reversible. The factory owners resisted every attempt to regulate their businesses, arguing that any interference with the free market would destroy British industry and throw thousands of workers out of employment. The political establishment was dominated by the propertied classes, who had little sympathy for the complaints of the poor, and a deep suspicion of any attempt to use the power of the state to redistribute the costs and benefits of economic change. And the workers themselves were divided by trade, by region, by religion, by gender, by the ancient, deeply ingrained habits of deference and hierarchy that made collective action difficult and dangerous. But progress, however slow, was real. The worst abuses of the early factory system were gradually eliminated. Working hours were reduced. Child labour was restricted and eventually abolished. Safety standards were improved. Public health measures, the provision of clean water, the construction of sewers, the regulation of housing, slowly brought the ravages of epidemic disease under control. By the last decades of the 19th century, the daily life of a British worker was, in most measurable respects, significantly better than it had been in the 1820s and 30s, not good by any means, but better. And with these material improvements came something else, a growing sense, among working people, of their own dignity and their own worth. The trade unions, the friendly societies, the cooperatives, the chapels, the working men's clubs, the mechanics' institutes, all of these institutions gave working people a voice, a community, and a means of self-improvement that had not existed before. The right to vote, extended to male householders in 1867 and to agricultural labourers in 1884, gave working men a stake in the political system and a weapon with which to demand further change. The emergence of the Labour Party at the turn of the 20th century gave the working class its own political voice for the first time in British history. These are the large movements of history, the sweeping changes that transformed a nation and reshaped a civilization, But they are also, at their root, stories about individual human beings, about men and women who got up every morning, went to work, came home, fed their children, worried about the rent, and tried, in the midst of a world that was changing faster than anyone could comprehend, to live decent, purposeful lives. It is their daily experience, the texture and detail of their ordinary days, that brings the history of the Industrial Revolution to life, and it is to that experience that we now return. There are certain cities that embody an age, and in the story of the Industrial Revolution, that city is Manchester. No other place on earth was transformed so rapidly, so thoroughly, or so visibly by the forces of industrialisation. In 1750, Manchester was a pleasant enough market town in the county of Lancashire, a place of perhaps 17,000 souls, known chiefly for its fustian trade and its proximity to the Pennine Hills, which rose in a blue-green line along the eastern horizon. By 1850, it was a teeming metropolis of over 300,000 people, the undisputed capital of the world's cotton industry, a place of staggering wealth and appalling squalor, of towering ambition and grinding poverty, of magnificent warehouses and foul-smelling cellars. It was, in the words of the French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited it in 1835, the place from which emanates the greatest stream of human industry to fertilise the whole world. And from that same place, he added, flows the richest stream of human industry to fertilise the whole world, even as the finest stream of human industry emerged from a foul drain. The cotton mills that lined the banks of the Irwell, the Medlock and the Irk were the engines of Manchester's transformation. By 1820, there were over 60 cotton mills within the town and its immediate surroundings, employing tens of thousands of workers and producing cotton cloth in quantities that would have seemed miraculous to an earlier generation. The raw cotton arrived from the slave plantations of the American South, bales upon bales of it, shipped across the Atlantic to Liverpool, and then transported by canal and later by railway to the mills of Manchester, where it was cleaned, carded, spun, woven, bleached, dyed, and finished before being shipped out again to markets around the world. The scale of this operation was breathtaking. In the 1840s, Lancashire alone consumed more raw cotton than any other region on earth, and Manchester was its beating heart. The warehouses of Portland Street and Mosley Street were cathedrals of commerce, grand, ornate buildings with classical facades and vast interior spaces filled with bolts of finished cloth stacked from floor to ceiling. The merchants and manufacturers who owned them were among the wealthiest men in England, and their influence extended from the trading houses of Calcutta and Canton to the corridors of Westminster and Whitehall. But the wealth of Manchester's cotton lords was built on the labour of a workforce that lived in conditions of almost unimaginable deprivation. The working-class district of the town, Ancoats, Angel Meadow, Little Ireland, the area around the River Irk, were among the most notorious slums in Europe. Friedrich Engels, who spent 2 years living and working in Manchester in the 1840s, described them in passages of vivid, horrified detail. In Angel Meadow he found masses of refuse, offal and sickening filth, lying in heaps along streets that were neither paved nor supplied with sewers. The houses were crumbling, the cellars were flooded, and the air was thick with the stench of the open cesspools that served in place of proper sanitation. In Little Ireland, an area just south of Oxford Road, named for the Irish immigrants who made up a large proportion of its population, conditions were, if anything, even worse. The houses were packed so tightly together that the sunlight never reached the ground between them. The streets were rivers of filth. The people who lived there, Irish families who had fled the poverty and famine of their homeland, only to find a different kind of misery in the factory towns of England, were among the poorest and most despised members of the industrial working class. They were willing to work for wages that no English worker would accept, and they were, in consequence, both essential to the cotton industry and deeply resented by the native workforce. The Irish immigration to the industrial towns of England was one of the great demographic movements of the 19th century. Driven from their homeland by poverty, by the failure of the potato crop, and ultimately by the catastrophic famine of 1845 to 1852, millions of Irish men, women and children crossed the sea to England, Scotland and Wales, seeking work and survival in the factories, the docks and the building sites of the industrial heartland. They settled in the poorest districts of the towns, forming communities that were at once fiercely loyal and deeply isolated, bound together by shared language, religion and experience, but separated from the wider society by prejudice, poverty, and the bitter memory of centuries of English domination. The Irish brought with them a willingness to do the hardest, dirtiest, most dangerous work, the work that no one else wanted. They dug the canals and built the railways, they shovelled coal and hauled bricks, they worked in the most dangerous sections of the factories and the mines. They were, in many ways, the invisible labour force of the Industrial Revolution, the hands that built the infrastructure of modern Britain, but received little of the credit and none of the reward. Their contribution to the industrial economy was immense, but their suffering was equally so, and the scars of that experience would be felt for generations. But Manchester was only one part of the story. Let us travel now to Birmingham, that great manufacturing town in the Midlands, and discover a very different kind of industrial experience. Where Manchester was dominated by the cotton mill, a single, vast, highly mechanised enterprise employing hundreds or thousands of workers under one roof, Birmingham was characterised by a multitude of small workshops, each specialising in a particular product or a particular stage of production. The 1,000 trades of Birmingham, as they were known, produced an extraordinary range of manufactured goods: nails, screws, pins, needles, buttons, buckles, swords, guns, jewellery, brass fittings, papier-mâché ware, steel pens, and 100 other items, each one produced in its own specialised workshop by its own specialised workforce. This gave Birmingham a very different character from Manchester. The typical Birmingham worker was not a factory operative, but an artisan, a skilled craftsman who took pride in his trade and jealously guarded the knowledge and techniques that distinguished him from an unskilled labourer. Many Birmingham workshops were small, employing fewer than a dozen men, and the relationship between master and worker was often close and relatively egalitarian. The pace of work was set not by the machine, but by the worker himself, and the old customs of the trade, the right to take time off for drinking, the observance of irregular working hours, the pride in the quality of the finished product, persisted in Birmingham long after they had been driven out of the cotton mills of Lancashire. This is not to say that Birmingham was a worker's paradise. The workshops could be cramped, poorly ventilated and hazardous. Many of the trades involved exposure to toxic substances, lead in the paint and pottery trades, mercury in the hat trade, phosphorus in the match trade, that caused chronic illness and early death. The needle-pointers of Redditch, who spent their days grinding the points of needles on revolving stone wheels, breathed in a fine dust of steel and stone that destroyed their lungs and killed them, on average, by the age of 30. The japanners and lacquerers of Birmingham worked with naphtha and turpentine, whose fumes caused headaches, nausea, and over time serious damage to the liver and nervous system, and the wages, though often higher than those of factory workers, were subject to wild fluctuations. In good times, when demand for manufactured goods was high, a skilled Birmingham worker could earn a comfortable living. But in bad times, and bad times came with depressing regularity throughout the early 19th century, orders dried up, workshops closed, and families that had been living in modest comfort were plunged into destitution overnight. There was no unemployment insurance, no social safety net, no welfare state to cushion the blow. A worker who lost his job had three choices: find another one, apply to the parish for poor relief, or starve. Sheffield, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, was another town with its own distinctive industrial character. Famous throughout the world for its cutlery and its steel, Sheffield was a town of grinders, forgers, and metal workers, men who shaped raw iron and steel into the knives, scissors, razors, and tools that were shipped to markets from London to Lima. The trade was ancient. Sheffield cutlery was mentioned in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the 14th century, but it had been transformed by the new technologies of the Industrial Revolution. The grinders of Sheffield worked in small water-powered workshops known as wheels or hulls, positioned along the rivers and streams that flowed through the town. They sat at their grinding stones, large revolving discs of sandstone, holding the blades against the stone and pressing down with their weight as the sparks flew and the metal screamed. The work required strength, skill, and a steady hand, but its greatest danger was invisible: the fine dust that rose from the grinding stone and hung in the air of the workshop like a pale mist. This dust, composed of tiny particles of stone and steel, was inhaled with every breath, coating the lungs and slowly, inexorably destroying them. The condition was known as grinder's asthma or grinder's rot, and it was virtually a death sentence. Few grinders survived past the age of 35. Many died in their 20s. The Sheffield grinders knew perfectly well what was killing them, and some of them tried to protect themselves by wearing cloth masks over their mouths and noses. But the masks were ineffective, and many workers refused to wear them at all, considering them a sign of weakness or an impediment to their work. The master grinders, for their part, had little incentive to invest in better ventilation or dust extraction systems. The workers were easily replaced, and the cost of keeping them alive was, in cold economic terms, higher than the cost of letting them die. This was the brutal calculus of industrial capitalism in its rawest form. The reduction of human life to a line item in a profit and loss statement. It was not unique to Sheffield or to the grinding trade. It was the logic that governed the employment of children in the mines, the toleration of dangerous machinery in the factories, the neglect of sanitation in the towns, and the systematic exploitation of every vulnerable group in the workforce. It was the logic that the reformers of the 19th century sought to challenge and eventually to change. Let us now turn our attention to the mines, those dark underground worlds where some of the most dangerous and degrading work of the Industrial Revolution was performed. Coal was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, the source of the energy that powered the steam engines, heated the furnaces, and drove the machines that made everything else possible. Without coal, there would have been no steam power, no iron smelting, no gaslighting, no railways, no factories. Britain's abundant deposits of coal, concentrated in the coalfields of Northumberland, Durham, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Staffordshire, South Wales, and central Scotland, were one of the nation's greatest natural advantages, and the exploitation of these deposits was one of the most important economic activities of the age. But coal did not mine itself. It had to be dug from the earth by human hands, in conditions that were among the most dangerous and degrading in the industrial world. The miners who went down into the pits, men, women and children as young as 5 or 6, worked in darkness, in heat, in confined spaces, and in constant danger of cave-ins, explosions and flooding. The typical coal mine of the early 19th century was a primitive affair. A shaft, sometimes little more than a hole in the ground, led down to a network of tunnels or headings that followed the seam of coal through the rock. The tunnels were narrow, sometimes no more than 3 feet high, and the miners worked on their hands and knees or on their bellies, hacking at the coal face with picks and loading the loosened coal into small carts or baskets that were then dragged or pushed to the bottom of the shaft and hauled to the surface. The hauling of coal was some of the most physically punishing work in the mine, and it was often done by women and children. In the mines of Scotland and the north of England, women worked as bearers, carrying baskets of coal on their backs up steep, narrow staircases, sometimes climbing hundreds of feet from the bottom of the mine to the surface, bent double under loads of coal that could weigh as much as 100 weight. Children worked as trappers, sitting alone in the darkness beside the ventilation doors, opening and closing them as the coal carts passed through. The youngest trappers were as young as 5 years old, and they sat in absolute darkness for 12 hours or more at a stretch, with nothing for company but the rats and the distant sounds of the miners at work. The danger of explosion was the miners' greatest fear. The gases that accumulated in the underground workings, methane known as fire damp and carbon monoxide known as after damp, were invisible, odourless and lethal. A spark from a pick striking a stone, a carelessly handled candle, or a sudden release of gas from the coal face could trigger an explosion of devastating force, collapsing tunnels, igniting coal dust, and killing or trapping everyone in the affected area. The worst mining disasters claimed hundreds of lives at a time. The explosion at Felling Colliery in 1812 killed 92 men and boys. The explosion at Haswell Colliery in 1844 killed 95, and these were only two of the hundreds of such disasters that punctuated the history of the coal industry throughout the 19th century. The invention of the safety lamp, developed independently by Sir Humphrey Davy and George Stephenson in 1815 and 1816, reduced the risk of explosion by enclosing the flame of the miner's lamp in a fine wire mesh that prevented it from igniting the surrounding gas. But the safety lamp was not a complete solution. It was fragile, it gave off a dim and unsatisfactory light, and its very existence encouraged mine owners to work deeper and more dangerous seams that had previously been considered too hazardous to exploit. The result was that the total number of mining deaths continued to rise even after the introduction of the safety lamp. Flooding was another constant hazard. The coal seams lay deep beneath the water table, and the tunnels were in perpetual danger of being inundated by groundwater that seeped through the surrounding rock. Keeping the mines dry required constant pumping, initially by hand, then by horse-powered pumps, and eventually by the steam engines that Thomas Newcomen and later James Watt developed specifically for this purpose. The Newcomen engine, first installed at a coal mine near Dudley Castle in 1712, was a clumsy, inefficient machine, but it could pump water from depths that no other technology could reach, and it became an indispensable part of the mining industry long before it found applications in other fields. The lives of the mining communities were shaped by the ever-present awareness of danger. Every family in a pit village knew someone who'd been killed or injured in the mine: a father, a brother, a husband, a son. The sound of the pithead bell tolling after an accident was the most dreaded sound in the village, and the scenes of grief at the pit mouth, the weeping wives, the anxious children, the grim-faced rescue teams, were repeated with terrible regularity throughout the coalfields. And yet the mining communities were also among the most tightly knit and resilient in industrial Britain. Bound together by shared danger and shared hardship, the pit villages developed a culture of solidarity and mutual support that was, in many ways, the strongest and most enduring legacy of the industrial experience. The miners looked after their own, supporting the families of the dead and injured, organising relief funds and friendly societies, and standing together in times of industrial dispute with a unity and determination that made them one of the most formidable groups in the labour movement. The women of the mining communities played a vital role in sustaining this culture. While the men were underground, the women maintained the household, raised the children, managed the family budget, and provided the emotional and practical support that kept the community functioning. They washed the men's pit clothes, heavy, coal-blackened garments that had to be scrubbed by hand and dried by the fire every evening. They prepared the hot baths that the miners took when they came up from the pit, heating water over the kitchen fire and filling a tin tub in the middle of the room. They cooked the meals, substantial calorie-rich food to sustain men who were burning thousands of calories a day in hard physical labour. And they bore the emotional burden of constant anxiety, the knowledge that every time their husband or son went down the shaft, there was a chance he might not come back. Let us move now from the depths of the earth to the surface of the water and consider the experience of another group of workers whose labour was essential to the Industrial Revolution, the canal builders and the navvies who dug the waterways and laid the railways that carried the raw materials and finished goods of industry from one end of the country to the other. The canal age began in the 1760s when the Duke of Bridgewater commissioned the engineer James Brindley to build a canal from his coal mines at Worsley to the growing town of Manchester. The Bridgewater Canal, completed in 1761, was a triumph of engineering, an artificial waterway that included an aqueduct carrying the canal over the River Irwell at a height of 39 feet, and it demonstrated in the most practical terms the advantages of inland water transport over the existing road system. The cost of transporting coal from Worsley to Manchester was halved almost overnight, and the success of the Bridgewater Canal sparked a nationwide frenzy of canal building that continued for the next 40 years. By 1800, Britain was crisscrossed by over 4,000 miles of navigable waterways, a vast network of canals, rivers and aqueducts that connected the mines and factories of the interior to the ports and markets of the coast. The canal system made it possible to move heavy, bulky goods, coal, iron ore, limestone, timber, pottery and bricks, quickly, cheaply, and in large quantities, and it was one of the essential foundations of industrial growth. The men who dug the canals, the navigators, or navvies as they came to be known, were a distinctive and often feared group. They were itinerant labourers, moving from one construction site to the next, living in rough camps of tents and huts beside the canal they were building. The work was brutally hard, digging through clay, rock and waterlogged soil with nothing more than picks, shovels and wheelbarrows. The navvies were paid by the piece, which encouraged them to work at a furious pace, and they burned off their energy in the evenings with prodigious feats of eating, drinking and fighting that earned them a fearsome reputation among the settled communities through which they passed. When the railway age arrived in the 1820s and 30s, it was the navvies who built it. The construction of the railways was one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century, and one of the greatest feats of human labour. Every mile of track required the moving of thousands of tons of earth, the cutting of tunnels through hills, the building of embankments across valleys, and the laying of track on a level and stable roadbed. All of this was done by hand, by men working with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, in all weathers and all seasons, for wages that were good by the standards of the day, but scarcely adequate to the effort required. The navvies who built the railways were a remarkable breed. They were strong, tough, independent and fiercely proud of their ability to do work that would break lesser men. They ate enormous quantities of food. A navvy might consume 3 or 4 pounds of meat a day, washed down with a gallon of beer, and they worked at a pace that astonished foreign observers. A skilled navvy could move 20 tons of earth in a day, using nothing more than his own strength and a shovel. And they did this day after day, week after week, month after month, in conditions that were often appalling, in rain and mud, in tunnels that collapsed without warning, on embankments that slid and shifted beneath their feet. The death toll on the railway construction sites was horrifying. Cave-ins, landslides, explosions and falls claimed the lives of hundreds of navvies every year, and thousands more were injured. The construction of the Woodhead Tunnel, which carried the railway between Manchester and Sheffield through 3 miles of solid rock beneath the Pennines, was one of the most deadly construction projects in British history. Over 30 men were killed during the 7 years of construction, and hundreds more were injured, a casualty rate that was higher, proportionally, than that of many military campaigns. Let us turn now to another thread of the story: the experience of women in the industrial age. The Industrial Revolution transformed the lives of women as profoundly as it transformed everything else, but the nature of that transformation was complex, contradictory, and far from uniform. For some women, the new factories and workshops offered opportunities for paid employment that had not existed before, a chance to earn their own money, to achieve a measure of independence, and to escape the confines of a domestic sphere that, for all its warmth, could also be stifling and oppressive. For others, the factories brought only new forms of exploitation and new burdens to add to the old ones. In the early textile mills, women made up a large proportion of the workforce, sometimes as much as half or more. They were employed as spinners, weavers, carders, and in a dozen other capacities, performing work that was considered suitable for their supposedly nimble fingers and their supposed docility. They were paid less than men, typically about half the male wage, and they were assigned the most repetitive and least skilled tasks, but they were paid, and in a world where economic independence was the exception rather than the rule for women, even a small wage could make a significant difference. The wages earned by women and girls in the factories contributed significantly to the family income, and in many cases they made the difference between survival and destitution. A family in which both parents worked could afford a better diet, a better home, and a better life than one that depended entirely on the father's earnings. And for unmarried women, widows, spinsters, and women who'd been abandoned by their husbands, factory work offered the only alternative to the workhouse, domestic service, or prostitution. But the cost was high. The working conditions in the factories were as harsh for women as they were for men. The same long hours, the same deafening noise, the same choking dust, the same risk of injury from unguarded machinery. And for women, there were additional hazards. Pregnancy and childbirth were, of course, a regular part of women's lives, and working in a factory during pregnancy, standing for 12 or 14 hours a day, breathing in cotton dust exposed to the heat and noise of the machinery, was a dangerous business. Miscarriages were common, premature births were frequent, and the women who returned to work within days of giving birth, as many were forced to do by economic necessity, risked their own health and the health of their newborn children. The care of infants and small children was one of the most agonizing dilemmas faced by working mothers. A woman who worked in a factory all day had no one to care for her children while she was away, unless she could rely on an older child, a neighbour, or a relative to look after them. Many mothers were forced to leave their infants with paid nurses or childminders, women, often elderly and impoverished themselves, who took in children for a small fee and cared for them, after a fashion, during the working day. The quality of this care varied enormously, but it was often woefully inadequate. Infants were drugged with opium-based preparations like Godfrey's cordial and Dalby's carminative to keep them quiet while their mothers were at work, a practice that was widespread, dangerous, and in many cases, fatal. The dosages were imprecise, and thousands of infants died each year from accidental overdoses of these preparations. The sexual vulnerability of women in the factories was another grim reality that is often overlooked in the larger narratives of industrial history. The power imbalance between the male overlookers and the female workers was enormous, and sexual harassment and exploitation were common. A woman who refused the advances of her overseer risked losing her job. A woman who complained risked being dismissed or blacklisted. And a woman who became pregnant as a result of such advances faced the additional burden of shame, ostracism, and the prospect of raising a child alone on a pittance. Outside the factories, women's work continued in its traditional forms, but transformed by the new conditions of industrial life. The domestic work of cooking, cleaning, washing and childcare was, if anything, more demanding in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the industrial towns than it had been in the countryside. The lack of running water, the absence of adequate cooking facilities, the difficulty of keeping a home clean in an atmosphere thick with smoke and soot. All of these made the daily round of household tasks a more exhausting and more frustrating experience than it had been in the villages from which many of these women had come. And there were new forms of home-based industrial work that exploited women's labour in ways that were, in some respects, even worse than the factory system. The sweated trades, needlework, dressmaking, shirt-making, box-making, matchbox-making, and dozens of other occupations employed women and girls in their own homes or in small workshops, paying them by the piece at rates so low that they had to work 16 or 18 hours a day just to earn enough to eat. The conditions of these trades were documented in harrowing detail by investigators and journalists throughout the 19th century, and they remained a scandal and a source of shame long after the worst abuses of the factory system had been addressed. Let us pause here and consider a subject that is often neglected in accounts of the Industrial Revolution: the experience of childhood. We have already discussed child labour, the employment of children in factories, mines and other industrial settings, and we have seen something of its horrors. But the experience of childhood in the industrial age was not defined solely by work. Children were also members of families, residents of communities, and participants in a culture that was being remade before their eyes. Their experience of growing up, of learning, playing, making sense of the world around them, was shaped by all of these factors, and it deserves our attention. For the children of the very poor, childhood as we understand it today, a period of play, learning and gradual development, protected from the demands of adult labour, simply did not exist. From the moment they were old enough to be useful, they were put to work. A child of 3 or 4 might be set to watch over a younger sibling while the mother was at the factory. A child of 5 or 6 might be sent to scavenge for scraps on the street, or to collect coal that had fallen from the carts, or to sell matches or flowers on the corner. A child of 7 or 8 might be sent to work in a factory, a workshop or a mine, earning a few pennies a day that were essential to the family's survival. Education for the children of the working class was a luxury that few could afford. There were no compulsory education laws in Britain until 1870, and even after that date, enforcement was lax and attendance was irregular. The schools that existed for the poor, the Sunday schools, the charity schools, the dame schools and the ragged schools, were often well-intentioned but inadequately funded and poorly staffed. A dame school, for instance, was simply the front room of a cottage, presided over by an elderly woman who charged a few pennies a week to look after a dozen or more children, teaching them the basics of reading, and perhaps a little writing and arithmetic while she went about her own household tasks. The quality of education in such a school was, to put it kindly, variable. The Sunday school movement, which began in the 1780s with the work of Robert Raikes in Gloucester, was perhaps the most successful attempt to provide education for the children of the poor before the advent of state-funded schooling. By 1800, there were over 300,000 children attending Sunday schools across England and Wales, and by 1850, the number had grown to over 2 million. The curriculum was focused on religious instruction, reading the Bible, learning the catechism, singing hymns, but it also taught the rudiments of literacy and gave many working-class children their only sustained contact with the written word. The play of working-class children, when they had time for it, was robust, inventive, and often dangerous. The streets of the industrial towns were their playground, a landscape of cobblestones and gutters, of lampposts and doorsteps, of canal banks and railway embankments. They played games that had been passed down through generations: tag, hide and seek, hopscotch, marbles, skipping, and they invented new ones to suit their environment. They climbed walls, they swam in canals, they hitched rides on the back of carts, they explored the waste ground and the ruins that lay between the factories and the houses. They were tough, resourceful, and prematurely old. Children who had learned from the earliest age to fend for themselves in a world that offered them little protection and less sympathy. The streets were also the domain of the child gangs, loose, informal groups of boys and girls who roamed the industrial towns, engaging in petty theft, scavenging, and occasional violence. The juvenile delinquent was a new figure in British social life, a product of the industrial city, where the traditional forms of social control, the family, the church, the village community, had broken down and been replaced by nothing adequate to the task. The phenomenon alarmed the middle classes, who saw in the ragged, unschooled children of the streets a threat to property, to morality, and to the social order itself. The response was a mixture of charity and coercion. Reformers established ragged schools, industrial schools, and reformatories for the children of the poor, offering education, training, and discipline in varying proportions. The law was tightened. The establishment of a professional police force in London in 1829 and in the provinces in the years that followed brought a new level of surveillance and control to the streets of the industrial towns. And the workhouse, that grim institution at the heart of the poor law system, provided a last resort for the destitute, offering food and shelter in exchange for hard labour and the surrender of personal freedom. The workhouse deserves a moment of our attention, for it was one of the defining institutions of industrial Britain, a place that embodied, in its architecture and its administration, the attitudes of the age toward poverty and the poor. The New Poor Law of 1834, which established the workhouse system in its modern form, was based on a simple and pitiless principle. The condition of the pauper inside the workhouse should be less comfortable than that of the poorest labourer outside it. This principle, known as less eligibility, was intended to deter people from seeking relief unless they were truly desperate, and to ensure that the workhouse was always the last, not the first, resort of the needy. In practice, this meant that the workhouses were deliberately made as unpleasant as possible. The food was meagre and monotonous: bread, gruel, cheese, and occasionally a thin soup with scraps of meat. The work was hard and humiliating: picking oakum, breaking stones, grinding corn. The inmates were separated by sex and age, husbands from wives, parents from children, and confined to their respective wards, with only limited opportunities for contact. The discipline was strict, the routine was deadening, and the atmosphere was one of enforced misery that crushed the spirit as effectively as any factory. The workhouse was feared and hated by the working class with an intensity that is difficult to overstate. To go on the parish, to enter the workhouse, was to admit failure, to lose one's independence, and to submit to a regime that was designed, quite deliberately, to humiliate and degrade. Many people chose to starve rather than enter the workhouse, and the stories of those who did enter it, the separated families, the humiliated old people, the children raised in the institutional care without love or affection, remain among the most painful chapters in the social history of Britain. Let us now shift our gaze to a very different aspect of daily life during the Industrial Revolution, the world of technology and invention, and the ways in which new machines and new processes transformed the ordinary experience of living. The steam engine, perhaps more than any other single invention, was the defining technology of the age. In its earliest form, the atmospheric engine developed by Thomas Newcomen in the first decade of the 18th century, it was a ponderous, inefficient machine used primarily for pumping water out of mines. But in the hands of James Watt, who improved the engine dramatically in the 1760s and 70s by adding a separate condenser, a rotary motion mechanism, and a governor to regulate speed, the steam engine became a versatile and powerful prime mover that could be applied to virtually any industrial process. By 1800, Watt's engines were at work in mines, in mills, in ironworks, in breweries, and in a dozen other industries. By 1820, the high-pressure engines developed by Richard Trevithick and others had made steam power compact and mobile enough to drive locomotives and steamships. By 1850, the steam engine was the dominant source of industrial power in Britain, generating the energy that drove the looms, the hammers, the bellows, the presses, and the pumps of the world's most industrialized economy. The impact of steam power on daily life was both direct and indirect. Directly, the steam engine created a new kind of workplace, the steam-powered factory, which could be built anywhere, regardless of the availability of water power, and which could operate at any time of day or night regardless of the season or the weather. This freed industry from its dependence on the river valleys and the rural hinterland, and allowed factories to be concentrated in the towns, where labour was abundant and transportation links were good. The result was the rapid growth of the industrial towns: Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Glasgow, that became the centres of British economic life. Indirectly, the steam engine transformed the experience of travel. Before the railways, the fastest way to travel overland was by stagecoach, a bone-rattling, exhausting, and often dangerous mode of transport that covered, at best, 10 or 12 miles an hour. A journey from London to Manchester, which can be made today in a little over 2 hours by train, took 2 full days by stagecoach in the 1820s, with stops for changes of horse and overnight stays at coaching inns along the way. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830 changed everything. For the first time in history, it was possible to travel at speeds greater than a galloping horse, 30 miles an hour, then 40, then 50, then faster still. The sensation was extraordinary, even terrifying to people who had never experienced anything like it. The countryside flew past the windows in a blur of green and brown. The wind roared, the engine exhaled great clouds of steam and smoke, and the passengers, crammed into open or enclosed carriages depending on the class of their ticket, held on tight and marvelled at the speed. The railways transformed not only travel but trade, communication, and the very fabric of daily life. Fresh food could be transported from the countryside to the towns overnight. News could travel from one end of the country to the other in a matter of hours. Workers could live in one town and work in another. Families separated by distance could visit one another for the first time in years. The railway brought the world closer together, shrinking distances that had seemed immutable since the dawn of civilization, and creating a new sense of national unity and shared experience that had not existed before. Gaslighting was another technology that transformed daily life in the industrial age. Before gas, the only forms of artificial illumination were candles, oil lamps, and rushlights, all of them dim, smoky, and expensive. The streets were dark after sunset, and the interiors of houses and workshops were lit only by the feeble glow of whatever flames could be afforded. Gas, manufactured from coal at centralised gasworks and piped to individual homes, shops and street lamps, through networks of underground pipes, offered a brighter, more reliable and ultimately cheaper source of light. The first gas street lighting was installed in London in 1812, and by the 1830s, most of the major towns in Britain had gaslit streets. The effect was transformative. The evenings, which had been dark and dangerous, became brighter and safer. Shops could stay open after sunset. Factories could operate night shifts. Public entertainment, theatres, music halls, pleasure gardens could draw crowds in the evening hours. And in the home, the soft, steady glow of a gas mantle made it possible to read, to sew, to write letters, and to socialise in comfort after the working day was done. The coming of cheap printed matter was another quiet revolution that transformed the daily experience of ordinary people. Before the Industrial Revolution, books were expensive and literacy was relatively rare among the working class. But the combination of steam-powered printing presses, cheap paper, and a growing demand for reading material, driven in part by the expansion of education, brought the cost of printed matter down dramatically in the first half of the 19th century. Newspapers, pamphlets, penny magazines, and cheap editions of novels and religious tracts became available to a mass audience for the first time, and the working class, which had been largely excluded from the world of print, began to develop a reading culture of its own. The penny magazine, launched in 1832 by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, was one of the first publications aimed at a mass working-class readership. It offered a mixture of popular science, history, geography and general knowledge, illustrated with woodcuts and written in a clear, accessible style. It was followed by a flood of similar publications: Reynolds's Miscellany, Cassell's Magazine, The Family Herald, that catered to the growing appetite for information and entertainment among the literate poor. But the most popular form of reading matter among the working class was the novel, or, more specifically, the serialised novel, published in weekly or monthly parts at a price that even a factory worker could afford. Charles Dickens, whose career began with the serialised publication of the Pickwick Papers in 1836, was the supreme master of this form, and his novels, with their vivid characters, their gripping plots, and their passionate concern for the poor and the oppressed, reached an audience of millions. A new instalment of a Dickens novel was an event, eagerly anticipated and widely discussed, and the characters he created, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Ebenezer Scrooge, Mr. Micawber, became part of the common currency of English-speaking culture. The world of entertainment and leisure underwent its own transformation during the Industrial Revolution, though the changes were gradual and unevenly distributed. For the upper and middle classes, the industrial age brought new forms of recreation: the seaside holiday, made possible by the railways, the country house weekend, the art gallery and the museum, the concert hall and the opera house. For the working class, leisure was more constrained, but it existed nonetheless, and it took forms that were distinctively urban and distinctively working class. The public house remained the social centre of working class life, despite the best efforts of the temperance movement to close it down. The music hall, which emerged in the 1850s and 60s, offered an evening of entertainment, songs, comedy, acrobatics and burlesque, at a price that most workers could afford. Football, which began as an informal, unregulated game played on fields and in streets, was gradually organised and codified in the second half of the century, becoming the great working-class spectator sport. Cricket, horse racing, boxing and pedestrianism, competitive walking and running, also had large working-class followings. The seaside excursion, made possible by the railways, became one of the great pleasures of working-class life in the mid-19th century. Towns like Blackpool, Scarborough, Margate and Brighton developed as resorts catering to the working-class market, offering cheap lodgings, fish and chip shops, amusement arcades, and donkey rides along the beach. The annual works outing, a day trip to the seaside organised by the employer or the factory committee, was one of the highlights of the working year, a day of freedom, fresh air, and simple pleasure that was treasured long after it was over. The religious life of the industrial working class was another important dimension of daily experience. The established Church of England, with its hierarchical structure, its rural orientation, and its close association with the landed gentry, had little appeal for the men and women of the factory towns. Many of them turned instead to the nonconformist chapels, Methodist, Baptist, Congregational, and Primitive Methodist, that sprang up in the industrial districts in large numbers during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These chapels offered not just spiritual sustenance but a sense of community, a framework for moral and intellectual improvement, and a training ground for the skills of organisation, public speaking and self-governance that would prove invaluable in the labour movement and in the wider political struggles of the century. Methodism in particular played a crucial role in the cultural life of the industrial working class. Founded by John Wesley in the 1730s, the Methodist movement had spread rapidly through the mining and manufacturing districts of England and Wales, attracting converts with its emotional, participatory style of worship and its emphasis on personal salvation, moral discipline, and the equality of all souls before God. The Methodist chapel was, for many working-class families, the most important institution in their lives, a place of worship, a social centre, a school, and a forum for the discussion of the issues that mattered to them. It produced a generation of working-class leaders, men and women who had learned, in the chapel meeting and the Sunday school, the skills of reading, writing, speaking and organising that they would later apply to the cause of a labour reform and political change. Let us consider, too, the experience of class, that powerful, all-pervading social force that shaped every aspect of daily life in industrial Britain. The Industrial Revolution did not create social class. The distinction between rich and poor, between the powerful and the powerless, was as old as human civilization. But it did create a new class structure, one that was different in both its composition and its dynamics from anything that had come before. The old social order of landed aristocracy, yeoman farmers, and agricultural labourers was gradually overlaid and, in the industrial districts, replaced by a new order of factory owners, merchants, professionals, and wage labourers. The middle class, that amorphous, aspiring, anxious social group that stood between the aristocracy and the working poor, emerged as a distinct and self-conscious entity, with its own values, its own customs, its own sense of identity and purpose. The gap between the classes was enormous, and it was visible in every detail of daily life. The factory owner lived in a large, comfortable house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by gardens and servants, eating well, sleeping well, and enjoying the pleasures of leisure and culture. The factory worker lived in a cramped, damp, unsanitary tenement in the heart of the industrial district, eating poorly, sleeping badly, and spending every waking hour in labour or in the recovery from labour. The two classes lived within a few miles of each other, sometimes within a few hundred yards, but they inhabited different worlds that were separated not just by wealth and privilege, but by education, by culture, by language, and by the entire framework of assumptions and expectations that shaped their understanding of the world. The middle class of the industrial towns was, in many ways, the most dynamic and innovative social group in the country. Its members were entrepreneurs, inventors, engineers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and clergymen, men and women who believed in progress, in self-improvement, in the power of reason and industry to remake the world. They built the factories and the railways, the schools and the hospitals, the civic buildings and the cultural institutions that gave the industrial towns their distinctive character. They were the driving force behind the reform movements that sought to address the worst abuses of the industrial system. The campaigns for factory legislation, public health reform, the abolition of slavery, and the extension of the franchise. And they created a culture of respectability, of thrift, of moral earnestness, and of domestic virtue that became the dominant ethos of Victorian Britain. But the middle class was also in many ways complicit in the suffering of the poor. The factory owners who campaigned for political reform and the abolition of slavery were often the same men who employed children in their mills, paid starvation wages to their workers, and resisted every attempt to regulate their businesses. The moral framework that celebrated self-reliance and individual responsibility also stigmatized poverty as a sign of personal failure, and the middle-class view of the working poor oscillated between compassion and contempt, between the desire to help and the fear of being overwhelmed. This tension between the ideals of progress and the realities of exploitation, between the promise of improvement and the persistence of suffering, was the central contradiction of the Industrial Revolution, and it played itself out in every dimension of daily life, from the grandest political debates to the most intimate domestic arrangements. It is a tension that has never been fully resolved, and it remains, in many ways, the defining dilemma of the modern world. The Great Migration from countryside to city was not a single movement, but a series of waves, each one shaped by the particular economic and social conditions of its time. The first wave, in the late 18th century, was driven largely by the enclosure movement and the decline of the rural putting-out system. Families that had supplemented their agricultural income with spinning and weaving at home found themselves squeezed out by the new factories, which could produce cloth faster, cheaper, and in greater quantities than any cottage worker could hope to match. The hand-loom weavers, in particular, experienced a slow and agonizing decline that stretched over several decades, as the price of their labour fell steadily in the face of mechanized competition. In 1790, a skilled handloom weaver could earn a comfortable living, perhaps a guinea a week, which was enough to support a family, rent a decent cottage, and enjoy a modest degree of independence. By 1820, the same weaver, working the same hours at the same loom, might earn only 5 or 6 shillings a week, barely enough to keep body and soul together. By 1840, hand-loom weaving had become one of the most degraded and underpaid occupations in the country, and the weavers who still clung to their trade did so out of desperation, pride, or the simple inability to find anything better. The decline of the handloom weaver is one of the most poignant stories of the Industrial Revolution. These were men and women who had taken pride in their skill, their independence, and their status within the community. They had been the backbone of the old textile industry, the craftsmen who turned raw thread into finished cloth, working at their own pace, in their own homes, according to their own standards of quality. The coming of the power loom, which could do the same work in a fraction of the time with less skill and less cost, stripped them of everything that had given their lives meaning and left them stranded in a world that had no further use for them. Some weavers adapted, learning new skills and finding work in the factories or in other trades. Others clung to their looms until they could cling no longer, watching their families sink into poverty and their health deteriorate under the stress of overwork and inadequate nutrition. A few turned to drink, to crime, or to the kind of desperate radicalism that led them into the Luddite movement or the political agitations of the 1810s and 20s, and many simply died, worn out by a life of ceaseless labour and chronic want, their passing unmarked and unmourned by a society that had long since moved on. The second great wave of migration, in the 1830s and 40s, was driven by the combination of rural poverty, Irish immigration, and the expansion of the railway network, which made it easier than ever for people to move from one part of the country to another. The railways also created new kinds of work, not just in the construction of the lines themselves, but in the operation of the trains, the maintenance of the track, and the staffing of the stations and goods yards that sprang up along every route. Railway towns like Crewe, Swindon and Wolverton were built from scratch to house the workers who kept the system running, and they became, in their way, model communities, planned, orderly, and relatively well provided for, in contrast to the chaotic, unplanned growth of the older industrial towns. But the railways also brought disruption. The cutting of new lines through existing neighbourhoods could destroy entire communities overnight, displacing families and demolishing homes to make way for the track and the stations. The Great London termini, Euston, King's Cross, St Pancras, Paddington, were built on land that had been occupied by some of the poorest and most densely populated neighbourhoods in the city, and the demolition of these neighbourhoods added to the already desperate overcrowding in the surrounding areas. The experience of the rural migrant arriving in an industrial town for the first time must have been overwhelming. The noise, the smoke, the crowds, the stench, the speed and confusion of urban life, all of it was alien to someone who had grown up in the quiet, slow, familiar world of the village. The newcomer had to learn everything from scratch: where to find work, where to find lodgings, where to buy food, how to navigate the streets, how to deal with landlords, employers and officials, how to protect himself from the thieves, tricksters and exploiters who preyed on the ignorant and the desperate. Many newcomers found their way through the help of family members or former neighbours who had already made the journey and established themselves in the town. The kinship networks of the rural village were transplanted into the urban setting, and streets and neighbourhoods often took on the character of the regions from which their inhabitants had come. Irish neighbourhoods, Welsh neighbourhoods, Scottish neighbourhoods, each one a little enclave of familiar accents, familiar customs, and familiar faces in the midst of the vast impersonal city. The lodging house was often the first stopping point for the newly arrived migrant. These establishments, which ranged from the reasonably clean and respectable to the filthy and dangerous, offered a bed for the night, sometimes a whole bed, sometimes half a bed shared with a stranger, for a few pennies. The worst lodging houses were havens for the destitute, the criminal, and the desperate, places where men, women and children were packed together in rooms that defied description, sleeping on bare boards or on piles of rags, surrounded by vermin and the stench of unwashed bodies. The streets of the industrial towns were a theatre of daily life, a stage on which the dramas of poverty, commerce and survival were played out in full public view. The street vendors were a ubiquitous presence, hawking their wares from dawn to dusk: hot pies and muffins, baked potatoes, fried fish, watercress, lavender, matches, bootlaces, ballads, and 100 other commodities. The costermongers, itinerant fruit and vegetable sellers who pushed their barrows through the streets, were a distinctive and colourful part of the urban scene, with their own slang, their own customs, and their own fierce code of honour. Henry Mayhew, the journalist and social investigator, documented the street life of London in extraordinary detail in his monumental work, London Labour and the London Poor, published in the early 1850s. Mayhew's interviews with street sellers, beggars, scavengers, and other members of the urban poor revealed a world of astonishing variety and vitality, a world of improvised livelihoods, ingenious adaptations, and desperate survival strategies that existed just below the surface of respectable society. Among the most haunting figures in Mayhew's pages are the mudlarks, children and old women who scavenged in the mud of the Thames at low tide, searching for coins, nails, bits of rope and other scraps that could be sold for a few pennies. They waded barefoot through the cold, filthy mud, picking through the detritus of the city, the sewage, the dead animals, the rotting vegetables, the discarded refuse of a million lives, and they did it day after day, in all weathers, because there was nothing else they could do. The mudlarks were the very bottom of the urban economy, the people for whom no safety net existed, no charitable institution catered, and no social reformer had yet found a remedy. Let us turn now to the subject of clothing, one of the most intimate and personal aspects of daily life, and one that was transformed in fundamental ways by the Industrial Revolution. Before the coming of the factories, clothing was expensive, labour-intensive to produce, and relatively scarce. A working family might own only 2 or 3 sets of clothes, one for everyday wear, one for Sundays, and perhaps a spare set for special occasions. These clothes were made from wool, linen, or a blend of the two. Fabrics that were durable but coarse, itchy, and difficult to wash. Cotton, which would later become the dominant fabric of the industrial age, was still relatively expensive in the mid-18th century, and most working people could not afford it. The mechanization of the textile industry changed all of this. By flooding the market with cheap, mass-produced cotton cloth, the factories made clothing affordable for the first time to people at every level of society. The price of cotton fabric fell by over 90% between 1770 and 1850, and the result was a revolution in dress that was, in its own quiet way, as significant as any political upheaval. Working people who had previously been confined to a single set of rough woolen clothes could now afford to own several garments of lighter, softer, more comfortable cotton. They could change their clothes more often, wash them more easily, and present a cleaner, more respectable appearance to the world. The availability of cheap clothing also enabled a new kind of social display. The working class of the industrial towns developed their own styles of dress, distinct from both the rough homespun of the rural poor and the elaborate fashions of the wealthy. Sunday best, a clean shirt, a waistcoat, a pair of boots, a bonnet or a hat, became a matter of pride, a symbol of respectability, and a means of asserting one's dignity in a world that often denied it. The second-hand clothing market, which thrived in every industrial town, made it possible even for the very poor to obtain garments that were, if not fashionable, at least clean and serviceable. The transformation of clothing was paralleled by changes in personal hygiene and grooming. The idea that cleanliness was next to godliness, always a pious aspiration in earlier centuries, became a practical possibility for the first time, thanks to the availability of cheap soap, cheap cotton towels, and eventually piped water and public bathhouses. The bathhouse movement, which gained momentum in the 1840s and 50s, provided hot baths and laundry facilities for working-class families at a nominal cost, and it was one of the small but significant improvements in daily life that helped to make the industrial towns more livable. The food culture of industrial Britain underwent its own revolution during this period. The old rural diet, based on locally produced grain, vegetables, dairy products, and occasional meat, was replaced for the urban working class by a diet that was heavily dependent on commercially produced foodstuffs. Bread remained the staple, but the flour from which it was made was increasingly imported, first from Ireland and East Anglia, and later from the great wheat-growing regions of North America and Australia. Tea, which had been a luxury in the mid-18th century, became the universal beverage of the British working class by the early 19th century, consumed in vast quantities and sweetened with sugar imported from the plantations of the Caribbean. The fish and chip shop, which would become one of the most distinctive institutions of British working class culture, had its origins in the 1860s and 70s, when the combination of cheap fish brought by rail from the coastal ports, cheap potatoes, and cheap coal for frying created the conditions for a new kind of takeaway food that was hot, filling and affordable. By the end of the century, there were over 25,000 fish and chip shops in Britain, and the Friday night fish supper had become a cherished ritual of working-class life. The pub, as we've already noted, was the central social institution of the working-class community, and it served a variety of functions that went far beyond the simple provision of drink. It was a meeting place, a reading room, a concert hall, a debating society and a club, a warm, brightly lit space where people could gather after the working day to relax, to talk, to play cards or dominoes, to listen to music and to enjoy the simple pleasure of human company. The pub was also, for many workers, the only place where they could conduct certain kinds of business, hiring labour, negotiating contracts, settling disputes, and paying wages. Before the widespread adoption of banking, many employers paid their workers in the pub, a practice that conveniently encouraged the spending of a portion of the wages on the spot. The temperance movement, which sought to persuade working people to give up alcohol, had considerable success among the religious and the self-improving, but it never succeeded in displacing the pub from its central position in working-class life. The publicans fought back, improving their premises, offering a wider range of entertainment and adapting to the changing tastes of their customers. The grand Victorian gin palaces and public houses with their ornate glasswork, their polished brass fittings and their rich mahogany bars were temples of working-class sociability, places of warmth, light and conviviality that stood in sharp contrast to the dark, cramped homes and the grinding monotony of the factory floor. Let us now consider the role of religion in the daily life of industrial Britain, a subject that is often overlooked but that was, for millions of people, a matter of the deepest personal significance. The impact of the Industrial Revolution on religious life was complex and contradictory. On the one hand, the upheaval of industrialization created a spiritual hunger, a need for meaning, for community, for moral guidance in a world that was changing too fast to comprehend. On the other hand, the demands of factory work, the disruption of traditional communities, and the sheer physical exhaustion of the working day made it difficult for many people to maintain the habits of regular worship that had been part of rural life for centuries. The Church of England, the established church, struggled to adapt to the new conditions. Its parish system was designed for a rural population scattered across the countryside, and it was ill-equipped to serve the vast, teeming populations of the industrial towns. In many of the new factory districts, there was simply no church within walking distance, and the few churches that existed were often cold, uncomfortable, and unwelcoming to the working poor, who felt out of place among the better dressed and better educated members of the congregation. Pew rents, the practice of charging families for the right to sit in a particular pew, effectively excluded the poor from many Anglican services and the social atmosphere of the parish church, with its hierarchical seating arrangements and its elaborate rituals, was alien to the egalitarian instincts of the working class. The nonconformist chapels filled the gap. The Methodists, in particular, were extraordinarily successful in reaching the working class, establishing chapels in every industrial town and village, and developing a style of worship that was emotional, participatory, and accessible. The Methodist class meeting, a small group of believers who met regularly for prayer, Bible study, and mutual encouragement, provided a framework for intimate fellowship that was especially valuable to people who had been uprooted from their rural communities and cast adrift in the anonymity of the industrial town. The chapel choir, the Sunday school, the bazaar, the missionary society, and the temperance group, all of these activities offered opportunities for social connection, for self-improvement, and for the exercise of talents that had no outlet in the world of work. The primitive Methodists, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, the Unitarians, and the Quakers all had significant followings among the working class, each with its own distinctive style and emphasis. The Unitarians in particular attracted the more intellectually inclined members of the working class, offering a faith that was rationalist, liberal, and deeply committed to social reform. Many of the leading reformers of the 19th century, from Elizabeth Gaskell to Florence Nightingale, were Unitarians, and the Unitarian chapels of Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool were centres of progressive thought and social action. The role of religion in the lives of industrial workers was not confined to formal worship. Religious beliefs and values permeated everyday life, shaping attitudes toward work, family, morality, and the social order. The idea that hard work was a moral duty, that thrift was a virtue, that sobriety and self-control were signs of good character, these were religious ideas as much as economic ones, and they exerted a powerful influence on the behaviour and aspirations of the working class. The concept of respectability, that elusive but all-important quality that separated the deserving poor from the undeserving, was intimately bound up with religious values, and the chapel, more than any other institution, was the arbiter of respectability in the working class community. But religion also had a more radical dimension. The idea that all souls were equal before God, an idea that was central to Methodism and to the broader evangelical movement, carried implications that went far beyond the spiritual realm. If all souls were equal, then why should some men be rich and others poor? Why should some live in comfort and others in misery? Why should the laws and institutions of society be arranged to benefit the few at the expense of the many? These questions, which were asked with increasing urgency throughout the 19th century, drew their moral force from the religious tradition, and many of the men and women who fought for social and political reform did so in the name of a Christian vision of justice and equality. Let us turn our attention now to a specific and fascinating aspect of daily life in the industrial age, the transformation of time. We have already touched on this subject, the shift from natural time to clock time that accompanied the rise of the factory system. But the story goes deeper than the simple imposition of a schedule. The Industrial Revolution changed not just how time was measured, but how it was experienced, valued, and understood. In the pre-industrial world, time was elastic. It stretched and contracted according to the demands of the task and the rhythms of the natural world. A farmer worked when there was work to be done and rested when there was not. An artisan might labour intensely for 3 or 4 days and then take a day or two off to recover, to socialise, or simply to enjoy the pleasure of doing nothing. The boundaries between work and leisure, between effort and rest, were fluid and personal, and the idea that every hour of the day should be put to productive use was foreign to the pre-industrial mind. The factory changed all of this. In the factory, time was money, literally. Every minute that the machinery stood idle was a minute of lost production, a minute of wasted capital. The factory owners, who had invested enormous sums in their buildings and their machines, were determined to extract the maximum return on their investment, and that meant keeping the machinery running for as many hours as possible, every day, every week, every month of the year. The result was a new discipline of time, rigid, unforgiving, and measured not by the sun or the seasons, but by the clock on the factory wall. The workers resisted this discipline, at least at first. They clung to the old habits, the irregular hours, the Monday holidays, the leisurely pace that had been the rhythm of their former lives. But the resistance was gradually worn down by a combination of economic necessity — you had to show up on time or you would be fined or dismissed — social pressure. The chapel and the temperance movement preached the virtues of punctuality and regularity, and sheer habituation. Within a generation or two, the discipline of clock time had been internalized, had become so deeply embedded in the culture that it no longer felt like an imposition, but like a natural and inevitable way of organizing life, the spread of clocks and watches was both a symptom and a cause of this transformation. In the mid-18th century, a watch was a luxury item, a possession of the wealthy, displayed as a mark of status and refinement. By the mid-19th century, cheap watches manufactured in large quantities had made timekeeping available to virtually everyone, and the ability to tell time had become an essential skill of daily life. The pocket watch, worn on a chain and consulted at regular intervals throughout the day, became one of the defining accessories of the Victorian working man, a symbol of his commitment to regularity, punctuality, and the disciplined management of his hours. The standardization of time itself was another consequence of the Industrial Revolution, or, more specifically, of the railways. Before the railways, every town in Britain kept its own local time, based on the position of the sun in the sky. Bristol was 10 minutes behind London. Edinburgh was 15 minutes ahead. The differences were small, and in a world where people rarely travelled more than a few miles, largely inconsequential. But the railways, which needed to coordinate schedules across hundreds of miles of track, required a single, uniform standard of time, and in 1847 the railway companies adopted Greenwich Mean Time as the national standard, a decision that was gradually accepted by the rest of the country, and that gave Britain, for the first time, a single, unified time zone. This seems like a small technical matter, but it had profound implications for the experience of daily life. The adoption of a national time standard meant that, for the first time, everyone in the country was living in the same temporal reality, experiencing the same now, sharing the same framework of hours and minutes, and measuring their days against the same universal clock. It was one of the many ways in which the Industrial Revolution created a sense of national unity and shared experience that had not existed in the older, more fragmented, more localized world of the pre-industrial past. Let us spend a little time now, if you will forgive the phrase, on the subject of health and medicine in the industrial age, for this was an area of daily life that was profoundly affected by the changes wrought by industrialization. The health of the industrial working class was, as we have seen, appalling. The combination of overcrowded housing, contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, poor nutrition, toxic working conditions, and relentless physical labour created a perfect environment for disease, and the mortality rates in the industrial towns were a standing rebuke to a society that prided itself on progress and prosperity. But the very magnitude of the health crisis eventually provoked a response. The public health movement, which gathered strength in the 1830s and 40s, was driven by a growing recognition that the health of the population was not just a private matter, but a public concern, that disease could not be confined to the slums but would inevitably spread to the wider community, and that the economic cost of sickness and premature death was a burden that society as a whole could not afford to bear. The key figure in the early public health movement was Edwin Chadwick, a former secretary to the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who had been appointed secretary to the Poor Law Commission in 1834. Chadwick was not a doctor, and he was not, by most accounts, a particularly likeable man. He was pedantic, opinionated, and obstinate to a fault, but he was a tireless investigator and a formidable administrator, and his report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain, published in 1842, was one of the most influential documents of the 19th century. Chadwick's report, based on an exhaustive survey of living conditions in towns and cities across the country, painted a devastating picture of filth, disease, and premature death in the working-class districts. It documented the connection between unsanitary conditions and disease with a wealth of statistical evidence, and it proposed a sweeping program of reform: the provision of clean water, the construction of sewers, the regulation of housing, and the appointment of medical officers of health to oversee the sanitary administration of every town and city. The response to Chadwick's report was mixed. The reformers embraced it. The vested interests, the landlords, the water companies, the local authorities who would have to pay for the improvements, resisted it. And the scientific establishment was divided, with some physicians accepting Chadwick's miasmatic theory of disease, which held that disease was caused by foul air, and others questioning it. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming, and in 1848 Parliament passed the first Public Health Act, establishing a General Board of Health with the power to create local boards of health in areas where the death rate exceeded a certain threshold. The Act was a landmark, but its implementation was slow and uneven. Many local authorities resisted the imposition of central government oversight, and the costs of building sewers, laying water pipes and paving streets were formidable. Progress was measured in decades, not years, and the sanitary revolution that eventually transformed the health of the industrial towns was the work of a generation of engineers, doctors, administrators, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept that filth and disease were the inevitable companions of urban life. The greatest triumph of the public health movement was the construction of modern sewage and water systems. The vast, invisible infrastructure of pipes, tunnels, pumping stations and treatment works that carried clean water to every home and carried waste away to be disposed of safely. The construction of London's sewage system, masterminded by the engineer Joseph Basil Jett in the 1860s, was one of the great engineering achievements of the age. A network of over 80 miles of intercepting sewers that captured the sewage that had previously flowed into the Thames and carried it to treatment works downstream. The project cost millions of pounds and took over a decade to complete, but it transformed the health of the capital and became a model for cities around the world. The discovery of the germ theory of disease, the understanding that infectious diseases are caused not by miasma but by microscopic organisms, was another landmark in the history of public health. The work of Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany in the 1860s, 70s and 80s laid the scientific foundations for a new understanding of disease transmission and opened the way for vaccines, antiseptics, and other medical interventions that would save millions of lives in the decades to come. But it took time for the new theory to be accepted and applied, and the full benefits of the germ theory were not felt by the general population until the last years of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th. In the meantime, the daily experience of illness remained, for most people, a matter of traditional remedies, folk wisdom, and the ministrations of untrained practitioners. The patent medicine trade, a vast and lucrative industry that sold pills, potions, and elixirs, promising to cure everything from headaches to consumption, thrived on the ignorance and desperation of the sick, offering hope where there was none, and doing, in many cases, more harm than good. The medicines themselves were often little more than flavoured water, sugar pills, or, in the most dangerous cases, preparations containing opium, mercury, arsenic, or other toxic substances that could cause addiction, poisoning, and death. The hospital, which would later become the central institution of modern medicine, was, in the early 19th century, a place of last resort, a charity institution for the desperately ill and the destitute, where the chances of recovery were often slim. Hospitals were overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly staffed, and the risk of contracting a secondary infection, hospital fever, gangrene, or blood poisoning, was high enough to deter all but the most desperate from seeking admission. Surgery, before the discovery of anaesthesia in the 1840s and antiseptics in the 1860s, was a brutal, excruciating, and often fatal procedure, performed at breakneck speed by surgeons who had no understanding of infection and no means of controlling it. the transformation of medicine from a primitive, largely ineffective art to a science-based profession capable of preventing and curing many of the diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries, was one of the great achievements of the age that the Industrial Revolution inaugurated. But for most of the period we're discussing, that transformation was still in its early stages, and the daily experience of illness, injury and death remained much as it had been for centuries, a matter of pain, uncertainty, and resignation to the will of God or the workings of fate. Let us pause here and consider what we have learned so far about the daily life of people during the Industrial Revolution. We have seen how the rhythms of work were transformed, from the seasonal, self-directed labour of the countryside to the regimented, clock-driven routine of the factory. We have seen how the landscape of home changed, from the small, scattered cottages of the rural village to the crowded, unsanitary tenements of the industrial town. We have seen how the experience of childhood was reshaped, from a gradual, if imperfect, preparation for adult life within the family to the brutal early entry into the workforce that was the lot of millions of working-class children. We have seen how the bonds of community were stretched and sometimes broken by migration, by the anonymity of urban life, and by the relentless pressure of economic forces that valued productivity above all else. And we have seen too the seeds of change, the beginnings of the reform movements, the growth of the trade unions, the spread of education, the slow improvement of public health, and the emergence of a working-class culture that was resilient, resourceful, and determined to claim its place in the world. All of these threads are woven together in the fabric of daily life, a fabric that was, for the people who lived it, not a grand historical narrative but a succession of ordinary days, each one filled with the small dramas and quiet victories and painful disappointments that make up the texture of any human life. A woman rising in the cold dawn to light the fire and boil the kettle. A man walking through the dark streets to the factory gate, his breath clouding in the morning air. A child sitting in a schoolroom tracing letters on a slate. An old woman selling watercress on a street corner, her fingers blue with cold. A family gathered around the table on a Sunday afternoon, eating the best meal of the week, a joint of meat, a dish of potatoes, a pudding, and enjoying for a few hours the warmth and companionship that made the rest of the week endurable. These are the moments that the grand narratives of history often miss, the small, intimate, intensely personal moments that are, in the end, what life is made of. And it is to these moments, as much as to the great events and the famous names, that we owe our attention and our respect. The story of the Industrial Revolution is, at its heart, a story about people, about the extraordinary resilience, adaptability, and courage of ordinary human beings confronted with changes that were beyond their control and often beyond their comprehension. They did not choose the world they were born into. They did not ask for the factories, the machines, the smoke, the noise, the filth, the overcrowding, the exploitation, and the grinding poverty that were the daily realities of industrial life. But they endured it, they adapted to it, and in time they began to change it, to demand better conditions, better wages, better housing, better education, and a share in the prosperity that their labour had created. The gains they won were hard-fought and imperfect. The Industrial Revolution did not end poverty or injustice or suffering. No revolution does. But it set in motion a process of change that would, over the course of the following century, transform the conditions of daily life for millions of people in ways that the earliest factory workers could hardly have imagined. The 10-hour day, the weekend, the paid holiday, the minimum wage, the right to organise, the right to vote, the right to an education, the right to healthcare, all of these things, which we now take for granted, were won by the men and women who lived through the Industrial Revolution and refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. Their legacy is all around us, in the cities we live in the work we do, in the institutions that govern our lives, and in the values we hold dear. The Industrial Revolution made the modern world, for better and for worse, and the daily lives of the people who experienced it are the foundation on which everything that followed was built. To understand them, their struggles, their sufferings, their hopes, and their achievements, is to understand something essential about who we are and how we got here. The world they inhabited, the world of coal and steam, of spinning jennies and power looms, of smoky skies and crowded streets, is gone now, as distant from our own time as the Roman Empire or the court of Charlemagne. The factories that once hummed with the sound of 1,000 spindles are silent, their chimneys cold, their great rooms empty. The mines that honeycomb the earth beneath the coal fields are flooded and sealed. The canals that once carried the goods of an empire are quiet now, their waters reflecting the sky and the trees and the long slow passage of a narrowboat. But the people who lived in that world, the spinners and the weavers, the miners and the navvies, the mothers and the children, the reformers and the radicals, they are still with us in a sense. Their struggles shaped our world. Their suffering taught us lessons that we are still learning. Their courage and their endurance remind us that the human spirit is capable of bearing more than we might think, and of changing more than we might dare to hope. This has been the story of what daily life was really like during the Industrial Revolution, a story of darkness and light, of suffering and resilience, of loss and transformation. It is a story that has no neat ending, because the forces it set in motion are still at work in our world, still shaping our lives, still raising questions about the relationship between progress and justice, between innovation and human well-being, between the wealth of nations and the welfare of the people who create it. These questions are as old as the smoke that rose from the first factory chimney, and they are as new as the morning that is dawning outside your window. They are the questions that the Industrial Revolution bequeathed to us, its gift and its challenge. And they are questions that each generation must answer for itself, in its own way, in its own time. The great transformation that began in the river valleys and the coalfields of 18th century Britain was not just an economic or technological event. It was a human event, a story about people who worked, people who suffered, people who dreamed, people who fought for a better world, and people who, in the end, created one, imperfect, unfinished, and still unfolding, but a world that was, in ways both measurable and immeasurable, different from the one that came before. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember about the Industrial Revolution. Not the machines or the inventions, not the statistics or the dates, but the people. The millions of ordinary men, women and children who lived through it, who were changed by it, and who changed it in return. Their lives were not footnotes to a grand historical narrative. They were the narrative itself, the living, breathing, struggling, hoping heart of the greatest transformation in human history. As the evening settles over the last of those old industrial landscapes, the brick walls softened by the fading light, the cobblestones gleaming faintly in the dusk, the shadows lengthening across the empty mill yards, it is their voices we should listen for. The soft murmur of a mother singing to a sleeping child, the steady rhythm of a loom in a cottage window, the distant rumble of a train crossing the viaduct, carrying its passengers toward whatever the morning might bring. Their world is our prologue, their story is our inheritance, and their quiet endurance in the face of changes that no one fully understood and no one could fully control, remains, after all these years, a source of wonder and of deep, abiding respect. But before we let the evening close entirely upon this story, there are more scenes to visit, more lives to consider. more corners of this vast transformation that deserve our attention. The Industrial Revolution was not a single story. It was a million stories, happening simultaneously across a landscape that stretched from the smoky valleys of South Wales to the granite cities of the Scottish lowlands, from the canal-threaded heart of England to the windswept dockyards of the coast. Each place had its own experience, its own character, its own way of living through the great upheaval. And so let us continue a while longer, stepping quietly into a few more of those lives, those places, those moments that illuminate the human reality of the age. Consider the potteries of Staffordshire, that strange, otherworldly landscape of bottle kilns and smoking chimneys that clustered around the 6 towns of Burslem, Hanley, Stoke-upon-Trent, Fenton, Longton and Tunstall. Here, in the dark red clay of the Midlands, an entire industry had grown up around the manufacture of earthenware, stoneware and fine china, the plates and cups and saucers that graced tables from London to Calcutta, from New York to Sydney. The potteries were a world unto themselves. The air was thick with the smoke of the kilns, great bottle-shaped structures, some of them 40 feet tall, that burned coal day and night, firing the clay at temperatures that turned it from soft, pliable earth into hard, durable ceramic. The heat from the kilns was intense, and the potters who worked beside them, the throwers, the turners, the handlers, the painters, the firemen who tended the furnaces, laboured in conditions that were stiflingly hot, dusty, and dangerous. The children of the potteries were put to work at an early age, performing tasks that were often as dangerous as they were tedious. Young boys served as mould runners, carrying newly formed pieces of pottery from the workshop to the drying room on wooden boards balanced on their heads, a task that required a steady hand and a strong neck, and that could cause permanent damage to the spine and the joints. Girls worked as jigger turners, operating the wheels on which the potters shaped their wares, and as paintresses, applying the delicate decorations that gave each piece its distinctive character. The most dangerous occupational hazard in the potteries was lead poisoning. Lead was used extensively in the glazes that gave pottery its smooth, shiny finish, and the workers who handled these glazes, mixing the powders, dipping the pieces and cleaning the workshops, were exposed to high levels of lead dust that accumulated in their bodies over time. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, potter's rot as it was known, included abdominal pain, joint stiffness, tremors, loss of appetite, and, in severe cases, paralysis, blindness, and death. Women were particularly vulnerable, and miscarriages and stillbirths among female pottery workers were disturbingly common. Josiah Wedgwood, the greatest of the Staffordshire potters, was a man who embodied both the best and the most troubling aspects of the Industrial Revolution. Born in Burslem in 1730, the son of a potter, Wedgwood built a manufacturing empire that produced some of the finest ceramics in the world, elegant, beautifully designed pieces that combined artistic merit with industrial efficiency. He was an innovator, an entrepreneur, and a man of progressive instincts who campaigned against the slave trade and supported the cause of American independence. But Wedgwood was also a factory owner who organised his workforce along rigidly hierarchical lines, dividing the production process into specialised tasks that stripped individual workers of their traditional craft skills. His factory at Etruria, built in 1769, was one of the earliest examples of what would later be called scientific management, a system of production in which every step of the process was planned, timed and controlled by the management, leaving the workers with little autonomy or creative input. The result was higher productivity and lower costs, but also a loss of the pride and independence that had characterised the old craft tradition. Let us now journey northward, to the industrial heartland of Scotland, to Glasgow and the towns of the Clyde Valley, where a different but equally dramatic transformation was taking place. Glasgow, like Manchester, was a city that was utterly remade by the Industrial Revolution. In 1750, it was a handsome, well-ordered city of perhaps 23,000 inhabitants, known for its university, its cathedral, and its trade in tobacco with the American colonies. By 1850, it had become one of the largest and most heavily industrialised cities in Europe, with a population of over 300,000, a skyline dominated by factory chimneys and shipyard cranes, and a reputation for both commercial enterprise and social deprivation that rivaled anything south of the border. The industries of Glasgow and the Clyde Valley were diverse and interconnected. Cotton spinning, which had been introduced in the 1780s, grew rapidly and employed thousands of workers in mills along the rivers and streams of Lanarkshire and Renfrewshire. The iron and steel industry, fed by the rich deposits of coal and ironstone in the Lanarkshire coalfield, produced the raw materials for a vast range of manufactured goods, and the shipbuilding industry, concentrated on the banks of the Clyde from Glasgow downstream to Greenock, would eventually make the river the most productive shipbuilding centre in the world. The working-class districts of Glasgow were, by the middle of the 19th century, among the most overcrowded and insanitary in Britain. The closes and wynds of the old town, narrow passages and courtyards hemmed in by towering tenement buildings, were packed with families living in conditions of unimaginable squalor. A single room might house a family of 6 or 8, sleeping, eating, and living in a space no larger than a modern bedroom. Sanitation was primitive, water was scarce, and disease was rampant. The cholera epidemic of 1832 hit Glasgow with devastating force, killing over 3,000 people in the space of a few months. The experience of the Scottish industrial worker was shaped by distinctive cultural factors that set it apart from the English experience. The Scottish education system, which was more widespread and more egalitarian than its English counterpart, produced a working class that was, on the whole, more literate and more intellectually ambitious than the equivalent class south of the border. The ladder Pearts, the talented working-class boy who won a scholarship to the university and rose to a position of influence and responsibility, was a cherished figure in Scottish culture, and the aspiration for education and self-improvement was deeply embedded in the Scottish working-class tradition. The Scottish churches, the Church of Scotland and its various offshoots, played a central role in the life of the industrial communities, providing not just spiritual guidance but education, social welfare, and moral authority. The Kirk Session, the governing body of the local church, exercised a degree of social control over its members that would have been unthinkable in the more relaxed atmosphere of an English parish, monitoring behaviour, enforcing standards of conduct, and dispensing both charity and discipline with an even-handedness that was, depending on one's point of view, either admirable or oppressive. Let us turn now to the experience of the industrial towns of South Wales, where the discovery of rich deposits of coal and iron in the valleys of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire created one of the most concentrated industrial landscapes in the world. The ironworks of Merthyr Tydfil, Dowlais, Seaforthfa, and Nantyglo were among the largest and most productive in Britain. They drew their raw materials from the hills that surrounded them, coal from the mines, iron ore from the outcrops, limestone from the quarries, and they produced the pig iron and the bar iron that was shipped by canal and later by railway to the ports of Cardiff and Newport, and from there to markets around the world. The workers who operated these ironworks were a mixed population. Welsh-speaking men and women from the surrounding countryside, English migrants from the industrial Midlands, and Irish immigrants fleeing poverty and famine. They lived in settlements that had grown up around the works, rows of stone cottages climbing the steep valley sides, their windows looking out over the furnaces and the slag heaps, their gardens, when they had them, perpetually dusted with soot and ash. The work in the ironworks was heavy, hot and dangerous. The blast furnaces, which operated around the clock, produced rivers of molten iron that flowed into channels cut in the sand floor of the casting house, where they cooled and solidified into the heavy bars of pig iron that were the foundation of the industry. The puddlers, who transformed the brittle pig iron into malleable wrought iron, worked at temperatures that could exceed 200 degrees, stirring the molten metal in a furnace with long iron rods until it reached the right consistency, then lifting it out in glowing, dripping balls that weighed 100 pounds or more. The puddlers were the aristocrats of the ironworks, the highest paid, most skilled, and most physically demanding workers in the industry. They were proud, independent men who commanded enormous respect within the workforce and who used their strategic position, no one else could do what they did, to bargain for better wages and conditions. The Puddlers' Union was one of the earliest and most effective trade unions in the iron industry, and it set a pattern of organised labour that would be followed by workers in other trades and other industries. But most workers in the ironworks were not puddlers. They were labourers, carriers, fillers, and furnace tenders, men, women, and children who performed the heavy, unskilled work of hauling raw materials, loading furnaces, and moving the finished product. They were paid less, worked longer hours, and had less bargaining power than the skilled men, and their conditions were correspondingly worse. The mining communities of South Wales were in many ways among the most distinctive and cohesive in industrial Britain. The valleys, narrow, steep-sided and isolated, created natural communities that were by necessity close-knit and self-reliant. The chapel, the choir, the rugby team and the Working Men's Institute were the pillars of valley life, providing a framework for social interaction, cultural expression and mutual support that sustained the community through good times and bad. The Welsh language, which was the native tongue of the majority of the population in the early decades of industrialisation, gave the mining communities a cultural identity that set them apart from the English-speaking world beyond the mountains. The Eisteddfod, a festival of poetry, music and performance that dated back to medieval times, was revived and reinvented in the industrial era as an expression of Welsh national identity, and it became one of the most important cultural events in the life of the valleys. Let us move now to the docks and the ports, those gateways between the industrial heartland and the wider world, where the raw materials of industry arrived and the finished goods of industry departed. Liverpool, on the Mersey, was the great port of the Industrial Revolution, the point of entry for the raw cotton that fed the mills of Lancashire, and the point of departure for the manufactured goods that were shipped to markets around the world. By the middle of the 19th century, Liverpool's docks stretched for over 7 miles along the river, handling a volume of trade that was second only to London's. The ships that crowded the harbour, sailing vessels and steamships, cargo carriers and passenger liners, came from every corner of the globe, bringing cotton from America, sugar from the Caribbean, timber from Canada, tea from China, and wool from Australia. The dockers who loaded and unloaded these ships were among the most casually employed and most precariously situated workers in the industrial economy. The work was irregular, dependent on the arrival and departure of ships, the state of the tide and the weather, and the dockers assembled at the dock gates each morning, hoping to be selected for a day's work by the foreman who stood on raised platforms and pointed to the men they wanted. This call-on system was a daily humiliation that reduced skilled, experienced men to the status of supplicants, begging for work and competing with one another for the favour of the foreman. The dockers who were selected worked hard, heaving bales of cotton, crates of machinery, barrels of sugar and sacks of grain from the holds of the ships to the quayside, using nothing more than their own strength and a few simple tools. The work was dangerous. Crushed fingers, broken bones, and fatal falls were commonplace, and the pay was uncertain, varying from day to day depending on the amount of work available and the competition for it. The dock communities of Liverpool, London, Bristol and the other port cities had their own distinctive character. They were cosmopolitan in a way that few other working-class communities were, exposed to the sights, sounds and influences of the wider world through the constant flow of ships and sailors from every corner of the globe. Chinese, West African, Indian and Scandinavian communities established themselves in the dock areas of the major ports, creating a cultural diversity that was in many ways ahead of its time. And now, as the story draws toward its close, let us step back and consider the larger picture, the vast encompassing transformation that the Industrial Revolution wrought upon the daily life of ordinary people. The changes were so numerous, so pervasive and so profound that it is difficult to grasp them in their entirety. In the space of a few generations, perhaps 3 or 4 lifetimes, the entire fabric of daily existence was rewoven. The places where people lived changed, from scattered villages and market towns to dense, sprawling cities. The work they did changed, from the varied seasonal tasks of the farm and the workshop to the repetitive, regimented routines of the factory and the mine. The food they ate changed, from locally grown, home-prepared meals to commercially produced, often adulterated goods purchased from shops and vendors. The clothes they wore changed, from hand-spun, hand-woven woolens to mass-produced cotton fabrics. The air they breathed changed, from the clean breezes of the countryside to the smoke-laden atmosphere of the industrial town. The water they drank changed, from well and spring to piped supply, for better and for worse. The rhythms of their days changed, from the elastic, sun-governed time of the agricultural world to the rigid, clock-governed time of the industrial world. And the social bonds that held them together changed, from the intimate, face-to-face relationships of the village community to the more anonymous, more contractual, more fragmented relationships of the urban crowd. Some of these changes were, in the long run, for the better. The increase in material wealth, however unevenly distributed, eventually raised the standard of living for the majority of the population. The expansion of education gave working people access to knowledge and ideas that had previously been the preserve of the elite. The growth of political rights gave them a voice in the governance of their own society. And the advances in medicine, sanitation and public health that the industrial age set in motion eventually conquered many of the diseases that had haunted human existence for millennia. But other changes were, at least in the short term, devastating. The loss of independence and autonomy that came with the factory system was a spiritual as well as a material deprivation. The destruction of rural communities and the disruption of family life caused suffering that cannot be measured in economic terms. The exploitation of children, the oppression of women, the degradation of the poor, and the casual destruction of health and life in the pursuit of profit are moral stains on the record of the age that no amount of subsequent prosperity can entirely erase. The Industrial Revolution was, in short, a deeply ambiguous phenomenon, a transformation that brought immense benefits and immense costs, and that distributed them with a cruel inequality that remains one of the most troubling legacies of the modern world. It was not, as some historians have argued, a straightforward story of progress, of the triumph of reason, science and enterprise over the ignorance and backwardness of the past. Nor was it, as others have contended, simply a story of exploitation and suffering, of the ruthless extraction of wealth from the labour of the many for the enrichment of the few. It was both of these things and more, a story of human complexity, of competing interests and conflicting values, of great achievements and great failures, all tangled together in a web of cause and effect that defies simple judgment. And at the centre of this story, always, are the people, the men, women and children whose daily lives were the raw material of the Great Transformation. They didn't think of themselves as historical actors. They did not know that they were living through the most important economic event in human history. They thought about the same things that people have always thought about: their families, their work, their health, their hopes, and their fears. They worried about whether there would be enough food on the table, whether the rent would be paid, whether the children would survive the winter, whether there would be work tomorrow. And they found, as people always do, moments of grace amid the hardship, moments of love, of laughter, of beauty, of connection that made the struggle worthwhile. A father carrying his sleeping child home through the dark streets after a long day at the mill. A mother sitting by the fire mending a child's shirt by candlelight, humming a tune she learned from her own mother years ago. A group of friends gathering at the pub on a Saturday evening, sharing a pint and a story and the simple, irreplaceable pleasure of human company. A young couple walking together along the canal bank on a summer evening, the water still and golden in the fading light, the factories quiet for once, the sky above them streaked with pink and amber as the sun goes down behind the chimneys. These moments matter. They matter because they remind us that history is not just about machines and economics and political movements. It is about human beings, living their lives as best they can, finding meaning and beauty and joy in circumstances that would seem, from the outside, to offer very little of any of these things. The people of the Industrial Revolution were not statistics or case studies or illustrations of a thesis. They were individuals, each one with their own story, their own personality, their own unique experience of the vast, bewildering, terrifying, exhilarating transformation that was remaking their world. To tell their story, to try, however imperfectly, to recover the texture and the feeling of their daily lives, is an act of respect, a way of honouring the human reality that lies beneath the grand narratives of progress and decline. It is also perhaps a way of understanding our own world a little better, of seeing the connections between their experience and ours, between the struggles of the past and the challenges of the present, between the world that was and the world that is. For the world we live in today is, in many ways, the world that the Industrial Revolution made. The cities we inhabit, the technologies we use, the economic systems that govern our lives, the social structures that shape our opportunities and our constraints, all of these have their roots in the transformation that began in the river valleys and the coalfields of 18th century Britain. We are the inheritors of that transformation, for better and for worse, and the daily lives of the people who lived through it are part of our own story, a chapter in the long, unfinished narrative of human striving and human endurance. The smoke has cleared now, the factories are museums, the mines are tourist attractions, the canals are pleasure grounds, the tenements have been demolished, and the slums have been replaced by housing estates and shopping centres and office blocks. The world of the Industrial Revolution has passed into history, as all worlds eventually do. But the people who lived in that world, the spinners and the weavers, the miners and the navvies, the mothers and the children, the dreamers and the fighters, they endure in our memory and in the world they helped to build. Their struggles were our struggles, in a deeper sense than we sometimes realise. Their hopes were our hopes, and their quiet, stubborn, magnificent refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have overwhelmed lesser spirits remains, across the distance of 2 centuries, an inspiration and a reminder of what human beings are capable of, not just of enduring, but of transforming, of creating, and of hoping, even in the darkest of times. The last light is fading now over the rooftops of those old industrial towns. The chimneys stand in silhouette against a sky that is slowly deepening from amber to violet to the dark, star-scattered blue of night. Somewhere a dog barks. Somewhere a door closes softly. Somewhere, in a room lit by the glow of a single lamp, someone opens a book, or takes up a pen, or leans back in a chair and closes their eyes, thinking about tomorrow. The story continues. The story always continues. And in the continuing of it, in the never-ending work of building, of striving, of making something better out of whatever the world gives us, we honour the memory of all those who came before, who lived through the fire and the smoke and the noise and the darkness, and who left us as their greatest gift the world we have today, imperfect, unfinished, but full of possibility. This is what daily life was really like during the Industrial Revolution. Not a single simple story, but a vast, complicated, contradictory, heartbreaking, and ultimately hopeful tapestry of human experience, woven from the threads of 1,000,000 ordinary lives in a time of extraordinary change. Yet there are still more stories tucked into the folds of this great era, stories that deserve to be told, not because they change the grand narrative, but because they add depth and colour and humanity to it. The Industrial Revolution was not only about cotton and coal and iron. It was about ink and paper, about glass and brick, about leather and bone, and every material that human hands could shape into something useful. Consider the printing trade, one of the oldest and most respected crafts in the country, and one that was profoundly transformed by the technologies of the industrial age. Before the coming of the steam-powered press, printing was a slow, laborious process, carried out by skilled compositors and pressmen who set each page by hand, letter by letter, and pulled each impression on a flatbed press that had changed little since the days of Gutenberg. The output was limited. A good pressman might produce 200 or 300 impressions in an hour, and the cost of printed matter was correspondingly high. The introduction of the steam-powered press in the 1820s and the rotary press in the 1840s multiplied output 100-fold. Newspapers that had been luxury items, read only by the wealthy and the educated, became mass-market publications, selling tens of thousands of copies a day at a penny or 2p each. The Times of London, which had been printed on a Stanhope hand press in the early years of the century, adopted a steam press in 1814 and saw its output soar from around 250 impressions an hour to over 1,000. By the 1860s, rotary presses could produce 10,000 copies an hour, and the age of mass communication had truly begun. The effect on daily life was transformative. For the first time in history, ordinary people had access to a daily stream of news, opinion, and information about the world around them. The morning newspaper became a fixture of the breakfast table, in middle-class homes read at leisure over coffee and toast, in working-class homes shared among friends and neighbours, read aloud in the pub, or pored over during the dinner break at the factory. The newspaper connected people to the wider world in a way that had never been possible before, giving them knowledge of events in distant cities and foreign countries, of parliamentary debates and scientific discoveries, of crimes and catastrophes, and the doings of the great and the famous. The penny post, introduced in 1840 by Rowland Hill, was another innovation that transformed the experience of daily life. Before the penny post, sending a letter was an expensive business. The cost of postage was determined by the distance the letter had to travel and the number of sheets it contained, and a single letter could cost as much as $1 or more. For the working class, this meant that correspondence with distant family members and friends was a rare luxury, and many people went for years without hearing from relatives who'd moved away. The introduction of a uniform penny rate for letters carried anywhere in the country made correspondence affordable for everyone, and the result was an explosion of letter writing that brought people closer together in ways that are difficult to overstate. Families separated by the migration from countryside to town could now exchange news and affection through the post. Lovers could sustain their courtships across distance. business could be conducted by mail with a speed and efficiency that had never been possible before. And the simple act of writing a letter, of sitting down with pen and paper and putting one's thoughts into words, became a part of the daily routine for millions of people who had previously had no occasion or opportunity to do so. The production of glass, that most magical and transformative of materials, was another industry that underwent a revolution during this period. Glass had been manufactured in Britain since the 17th century, but it was expensive and available only in limited quantities. The repeal of the glass tax in 1845 removed a significant financial barrier and led to a rapid expansion of the glass industry, which in turn made glass products, windows, bottles, drinking glasses, mirrors, and spectacles, available to a much wider market. The impact of cheaper glass on daily life was considerable. Windows, which had been small and often covered with oiled paper or thin horn in the poorest homes, could now be fitted with clear glass panes that let in light and kept out the weather. The difference this made to the quality of life in a working-class home was enormous. Natural light transformed dark, gloomy rooms into brighter, more cheerful living spaces, and the ability to see outside without opening the window was a small but significant improvement in comfort and security. Mirrors, once a luxury of the wealthy, became common furnishings in working-class homes, giving people the ability to see their own reflections clearly for the first time. Spectacles, which had been expensive and hard to come by, became more affordable, enabling older workers to continue reading and performing fine work long after their eyesight had begun to fail. And glass bottles and jars became the standard containers for food, drink and medicine, replacing the leather flagons, wooden casks and earthenware pots of an earlier age. The brick industry, too, played a crucial role in shaping the daily landscape of industrial Britain. The towns and cities that sprang up during the Industrial Revolution were built, for the most part, of brick, a cheap, durable, and easily produced building material that was perfectly suited to the demands of rapid urban expansion. The brick fields that surrounded every major town employed thousands of workers, men, women, and children, who dug the clay, moulded it into bricks, and fired it in kilns that burned day and night. The work in the brick fields was dirty, exhausting, and poorly paid. The brickmakers worked in the open air, exposed to rain, cold, and the baking heat of the summer sun. The women who carried the unfired bricks from the moulding tables to the kilns, the hack carriers, were among the hardest worked women in the industrial economy, carrying loads of 40 or 50 pounds on their heads for distances of 100 yards or more, making trip after trip throughout the long working day. The bricks they made built the world around them. The factories, the warehouses, the terraced houses, the churches, the schools, the railway stations and the public buildings that gave the industrial towns their distinctive character. The red brick of Lancashire and the Midlands, the yellow stock brick of London, the dark engineering brick of the canal and railway infrastructure. Each variety told a story of the local geology, the local industry, and the local labour that went into its making. Let us consider, too, the quieter revolution that was taking place in the world of retail, the way in which people bought and sold the goods they needed for daily life. In the pre-industrial village, shopping, as we understand it, barely existed. Most of what a family needed, food, clothing, fuel, was produced at home or obtained through barter and exchange within the local community. The weekly market held in the nearest town was the main occasion for buying and selling, and the range of goods available was limited to what local producers and travelling peddlers could supply. The growth of the industrial towns created a new kind of consumer economy. The factory workers, who earned wages in cash rather than in kind, needed to buy everything they consumed: food, clothing, fuel, household goods, from shops, markets, and street vendors. This created opportunities for a new class of retailers, from the corner shop and the general store to the butcher, the baker, the greengrocer and the draper, who set up business in every neighbourhood to serve the needs of the growing population. The cooperative movement, which began with the Rochdale pioneers in 1844, was one of the most innovative and enduring responses to the challenges of working-class consumption. The Rochdale pioneers, a group of 28 weavers and other tradesmen in the Lancashire town of Rochdale, pooled their resources to open a small shop that sold basic foodstuffs at fair prices, returning any surplus profits to the members in proportion to their purchases. The idea was simple, but its impact was profound. Within a few years, cooperative societies had sprung up in towns and cities across the country, offering their members not just cheaper goods, but a stake in the enterprise and a voice in its management. By the end of the century, the cooperative movement had grown into a major force in British retailing, with over 1,000 societies, nearly 2 million members, and a network of shops, bakeries, dairies, and factories that rivaled any private business. The co-op became a fixture of working-class life, a trusted institution that provided not just goods, but a sense of community, of ownership, and of collective purpose that was deeply valued by its members. The development of canned and preserved food was another innovation that changed the daily experience of eating for millions of people. The technology of canning, sealing food in airtight containers and heating them to destroy the bacteria that cause spoilage, had been developed in the early 19th century, initially for military use. By the middle of the century, canned meat, fish, vegetables and fruit were widely available in the shops of the industrial towns, offering working-class families a source of nutrition that was convenient, relatively cheap, and, when the canning process worked correctly, safe to eat. The importation of cheap food from abroad, grain from America, meat from Argentina and Australia, dairy products from Denmark and the Netherlands, further transformed the diet of the British working class in the second half of the 19th century. The cost of basic foodstuffs fell steadily from the 1870s onward, and the result was a gradual improvement in nutrition that was reflected in rising heights, declining mortality rates, and a general improvement in the physical condition of the working population. The transformation of transport, beyond the railways, which we have already discussed, also had a profound impact on daily life. The horse-drawn omnibus, introduced in the 1820s, and the horse-drawn tram, which followed in the 1860s, made it possible for working people to live further from their places of work, opening up new residential areas on the outskirts of the towns and beginning the long process of suburban expansion that would reshape the urban landscape in the decades to come. The bicycle, which became widely available in the 1880s and 90s, was another transformative technology, one that gave working people a degree of personal mobility that had never been possible before. A worker with a bicycle could travel further to find work, could visit friends and family in distant neighbourhoods, and could explore the countryside beyond the town in a way that had previously been impossible for anyone who could not afford a horse. The bicycle was, for many working-class men and women, a symbol of freedom, the first machine that extended their range and expanded their world without requiring them to surrender their independence to a timetable or a fare collector. As we approach the end of our journey through the daily life of the Industrial Revolution, let us return one last time to the homes and the families of the working class, to the intimate domestic sphere where the great dramas of history played out in their most personal and most poignant form. The family was the fundamental unit of industrial society, just as it had been of agricultural society. But the nature of the family and the relationships within it were profoundly altered by the new conditions of industrial life. The old rural family had been a unit of production, as well as of consumption, a team of workers who laboured together on the land and in the home, sharing the tasks and the rewards of their combined effort. The industrial family was something different, a unit of consumption that depended on the wages of its individual members, each of whom went out to work in separate locations and returned home at the end of the day to a domestic sphere that was, increasingly, defined as a place of rest and refuge rather than of productive labour. This separation of home and work, one of the most far-reaching consequences of industrialisation, had profound implications for the relationships between men and women, between parents and children, and between the individual and the community. The home became, in middle-class ideology, a haven in a heartless world, a place of warmth, comfort and moral virtue that stood in contrast to the cold, competitive, morally ambiguous world of commerce and industry. The wife and mother was elevated in this ideology to the role of angel of the house, the guardian of domestic virtue, the nurturer of children, and the emotional anchor of the family. For working-class families, this ideology was more aspiration than reality. The wife and mother of a working-class household was, as often as not, a wage earner herself, a factory worker, a seamstress, a laundress, or a domestic servant who combined paid employment with the unpaid labour of running a home and raising children. But the ideal of the domestic haven exerted a powerful influence on working-class culture, and the desire for a proper home, clean, comfortable and presided over by a wife who did not have to go out to work, was one of the strongest motivations driving working-class aspiration. The relationships between parents and children were also reshaped by the conditions of industrial life. The old pattern, in which children worked alongside their parents from an early age, gradually learning the skills of their trade through observation and practice, gave way to a new pattern in which children were sent out to work for strangers, often in occupations that had nothing to do with their parents' trades. The result was a loosening of the bonds between parent and child that had been one of the strongest features of the pre-industrial family. But new bonds were also being formed. The gradual restriction and eventual abolition of child labour, combined with the spread of compulsory education, created a new kind of childhood, a period of play, learning, and development that was, for the first time, recognised as a distinct and valuable stage of life, deserving of protection and nurture. The children of the late 19th century, the first generation to benefit from these changes, grew up in a world that was, in many ways, more protective, more nurturing, and more attentive to their needs than anything their grandparents had known. The evening meal, taken together around the family table, became the ritual centre of domestic life, the one moment in the day when the family came together as a unit, sharing food, conversation, and the simple warmth of companionship. For a working-class family in the 1870s or 1880s, the evening meal might be a modest affair, a stew of vegetables and a little meat, a loaf of bread, a pot of tea, but it was a moment of significance, a daily affirmation of the bonds that held the family together in a world that was constantly threatening to pull it apart. The Sunday dinner was the great weekly event, the meal that the family looked forward to all week and that the mother spent much of Saturday preparing. A joint of meat, beef, mutton or pork, roasted slowly in the oven of the kitchen range was the centrepiece, accompanied by roasted potatoes, boiled vegetables, and a gravy made from the drippings. The pudding that followed, a steamed suet pudding, a rice pudding, a treacle tart or a fruit pie, was the crowning glory of the meal, and the recipe for it was often a family secret, passed down from mother to daughter and guarded with fierce proprietary pride. These domestic rituals, the evening meal, the Sunday dinner, the Saturday bath, the Sunday walk, the weekly trip to the market, the annual holiday, were the threads from which the fabric of family life was woven. They were not grand or dramatic events. They were small, ordinary, everyday things, the kind of things that rarely appear in the history books. But they were the things that mattered most to the people who lived them, the things that gave shape and meaning and warmth to lives that were, in so many other ways, shaped by forces beyond their control. And so we come to the end of our journey. We have travelled a long way, from the quiet fields of pre-industrial England to the smoky streets of Manchester, from the depths of the coal mines to the heights of the factory chimneys, from the world of the handloom weaver to the world of the steam engine and the railway. We have met spinners and weavers, miners and navvies, factory children and mill girls, reformers and radicals, mothers and fathers and children. We have seen the beauty and the brutality of a world in transformation, the incredible courage and resilience of ordinary people in the face of extraordinary change, and the slow, painful, imperfect process by which a new and better world was built from the ruins of the old. This story has no final chapter, because the story of human progress never truly ends. The forces that the Industrial Revolution set in motion, the drive for innovation, the hunger for improvement, the tension between profit and justice, between efficiency and humanity, are still at work in our world today, still shaping our daily lives, still posing the same fundamental questions about the kind of society we want to build and the kind of lives we want to lead. But if this story teaches us anything, it is that change is possible, that the world is not fixed and immutable, but fluid and responsive to human effort. The men and women who lived through the Industrial Revolution did not accept the world as they found it. They pushed back, they organised, they demanded change, and they got it. Slowly, imperfectly, but surely. They proved that even the most powerful forces of history can be shaped and redirected by the determined efforts of ordinary people, working together, refusing to give up, and insisting that the future can be better than the past. That is their gift to us, not just the material comforts of the modern world, but the knowledge that we too have the power to shape our own future, to build a world that is more just, more compassionate, and more humane than the one we inherited. And in that knowledge lies the deepest and most enduring lesson of the Industrial Revolution, a lesson that is as relevant today as it was 200 years ago, and that will remain relevant for as long as human beings continue to strive, to struggle, and to hope. The night is deep now, and the old industrial landscapes lie quiet under the stars. The chimneys are dark, the mills are still. The rivers flow on as they have always flowed, carrying the reflections of the sky and the memory of the millions who once worked and lived and loved beside their banks. Their story is told, their world is remembered, and in the remembering of it, something precious is preserved, a connection to the past that illuminates the present, and that lights, however faintly, the way ahead.